Hello everyone, welcome back to Midnight Lullaby. I know many of you are here to drift gently into sleep. Before you close your eyes, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. I'd also love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know where in the world you're listening from. Now, turn off the lights, get comfortable, and let the story carry you into dreams. The cabin had been in my family for 3 generations. He perched on a hillside overlooking the Whitmore Valley, like a wooden sentinel keeping watch over the forests below. I inherited it from my grandfather, along with his collection of antique scientific instruments. Brass compasses, weather vanes, and a pair of German binoculars that he claimed could reveal things that other optics couldn't see. They're special. He had whispered during his final hospital visit, his weathered hands gripping mine with surprising strength. Made in 1943 by a craftsman who understood that seeing isn't just about light and lenses. They'll show you truth, but truth isn't always comfortable. Use them wisely at the time. I had assumed his words were the rambling of an old man whose mind had been clouded by pain medication and approaching death. The binoculars looked ordinary enough. Heavy black metal bodies with precision, ground German lenses. The kind of field glasses that military officers might have carried during the war. But they felt different when I held them. Warm to the touch, despite having been stored in a cool basement, and oddly heavy for their size. I brought them with me when I decided to spend a month at the cabin, hoping that solitude and mountain air would help me process the grief that had been consuming me since the divorce. The legal proceedings had ended 6 months earlier, but the emotional aftermath lingered like smoke in closed rooms, tainting everything I tried to enjoy. The cabin sat on the eastern slope of Pine Ridge, facing west toward Mount Cassidy across the valley. The view was spectacular dense forests giving way to rocky outcroppings, with the mountain's peak catching the last light each evening in a display of purple and gold that never failed to move me. It was the kind of vista that invited contemplation and observation. Perfect for someone trying to find perspective on a life that had suddenly changed direction. I established a routine quickly. Morning coffee on the porch, while watching the sun burn off the valley fog. Afternoons, hiking the familiar trails of my childhood. And evenings spent reading by the fireplace or stargazing from the deck. The binoculars became part of this ritual, helping me observe wildlife and study the geological features of the distant mountain. It was during my 4th evening that I first noticed the structure on Mount Cassidy's eastern face. I had been scanning the mountain slopes, looking for the elk herd that frequently grazed in the high meadows, when I caught sight of something that hadn't been there during my previous observations. Nestled among the rocks about 2/3 of the way up the mountain was what appeared to be a small cabin or shelter, its dark wood barely distinguishable from the surrounding stone. I lowered the binoculars and looked with naked eyes, but the distance was too great to make out any details. when I raised the glasses again, the structure seemed clearer, more defined, as if the binoculars were somehow enhancing the image beyond their normal magnification power. The cabin was simple but well built, with a stone foundation and what looked like a covered porch facing east. Directly toward my position, smoke rose from a chimney, indicating recent occupation, though I couldn't imagine who would choose to build in such a remote and inaccessible location. What struck me as odd was that I had never seen the cabin during my many childhood visits to Pine Ridge. My grandfather and I had spent countless hours with those same binoculars, cataloging the wildlife and geological features of Mount Cassidy. He had been meticulous in his observations, maintaining detailed journals of everything visible from the cabin's deck. Yet there had never been any mention of human habitation on the mountain. I spent the next morning researching property records and topographical maps, trying to determine if the cabin had been built recently or if I had somehow overlooked it during previous visits. The maps showed no structures on Mount Cassidy, and the entire mountain was listed as protected wilderness, making new construction virtually impossible. Yet when I returned to the deck that evening with the binoculars, the cabin was still there, smoke still rising from its chimney, looking as permanent and established as if it had stood among those rocks for decades. I decided to get a better look. The binoculars had an unusual weight distribution that made them comfortable to hold for extended periods, and the optics were remarkably clear despite their age. As I focused on the distant cabin, adjusting the eyepieces for optimal clarity, I began to notice details that should have been impossible to discern at such a distance. The cabin had 4 windows facing east, each framed with dark wood that looked hand-hewn rather than milled. A stone path led from the porch to what appeared to be a small garden or cleared area. Most remarkably, I could see movement inside the structure. Shadows shifting behind the windows, suggesting that someone was indeed living there. I watched for nearly an hour, hoping to catch sight of the cabin's occupant. The sun was setting behind me, and the golden light streaming across the valley should have made observation difficult due to glare and changing shadows. Instead, the view seemed to grow clearer as darkness approached, as if the binoculars were somehow compensating for the reduced light. Then I saw him. A man stepped onto the cabin's porch, and even at a distance of several miles, I could see him with startling clarity. He was tall and lean, wearing dark clothing that looked practical rather than fashionable. What made my hands tremble slightly as I held the binoculars was that he appeared to be holding optical equipment of his own. A pair of binoculars that looked remarkably similar to the ones I was using, and he was looking directly at me. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. The sensation of being observed was primal and unmistakable, triggering an instinctive awareness that something was watching me with the same intensity. I was directing toward it. I lowered my binoculars and looked toward the mountain with naked eyes, but the distance was too great to see anything clearly. When I raised the glasses again, the man was still there, still watching. His posture suggested patience and focus, as if he were prepared to observe me for as long as I chose to observe him. The situation felt like a standoff. Two watchers engaged in a silent contest of attention and will. I decided to wave, raising one hand in a gesture of acknowledgement or greeting. The response was immediate and unsettling. The distant figure raised his own hand in an identical gesture, mirroring my movement with perfect timing. It could have been coincidence or natural politeness, but something about the synchronization felt wrong. I tried a different gesture, touching my hand to my forehead in an informal salute. Again, the distant figure matched my movement exactly, as if he were my reflection in some impossible mirror stretched across the valley. Growing unsettled, I lowered the binoculars and went inside. But sleep that night was restless and filled with dreams of being watched by eyes I couldn't see. The next morning, I convinced myself that I had imagined the more disturbing aspects of the previous evening's observation. Stress and solitude could play tricks on the mind, and the idea of someone mimicking my gestures from miles away was simply not credible. I resolved to approach the situation more scientifically, treating it as an interesting puzzle rather than a source of anxiety. I spent the day researching the history of Mount Cassidy and the surrounding wilderness area. What I discovered only deepened the mystery. The mountain had been thoroughly surveyed multiple times by various government agencies, and no structures had ever been documented on its slopes. More intriguingly, several hikers over the years had reported seeing lights or signs of habitation on the mountain, but search and rescue teams had never found any evidence of human presence. One report from 1987 described a hiker who claimed to have observed someone watching him from the mountain's eastern face using binoculars. The hiker had been camping in approximately the same location as my family's cabin. He reported feeling observed for several days and described the watcher as mirroring his movements and gestures. The report was filed with local authorities, but no follow-up investigation was ever conducted. That evening, I returned to the deck with the binoculars and a notebook, determined to document whatever I observed with scientific objectivity. The cabin on Mount Cassidy was clearly visible again, smoke rising from its chimney. Windows glowing with warm yellow light that suggested oil lamps or candles, rather than electric lighting. I waited patiently for the occupant to appear, and just after sunset, he emerged onto the porch carrying his binoculars. This time, I was ready. I quickly sketched what I could see: his approximate height and build, the style of clothing, the type of optical equipment he carried. What I drew was disturbing in its familiarity. The distant figure was wearing the same style of dark sweater I had on. His hair appeared to be the same length and color as mine. Even his posture, as he raised the binoculars to his eyes, seemed to match my own stance. It was as if I were looking at myself from an impossible external perspective. I experimented with different movements, watching to see how quickly he would mirror them. The synchronization was perfect and instantaneous. When I raised my left hand, he raised his left hand. When I stepped to one side, he moved in the same direction. When I lowered my binoculars to wipe the lenses, he performed the identical action at the precise same moment. The mimicry was so exact that I began to wonder if I were somehow looking at a reflection. But that was impossible. The cabin was clearly miles away, on the opposite side of the valley, and there was no surface that could create such an effect across such a distance. I decided to test the limits of this strange synchronization. Moving slowly and deliberately, I walked to the far end of the deck, then back to my original position. Through the binoculars, I watched the distant figure perform exactly the same movements, pacing the length of his own porch with identical timing and stride length. Then I tried something more complex. I set the binoculars down on the deck railing, walked inside the cabin, and returned with a red flannel shirt that I pulled on over my sweater. When I picked up the binoculars again, the distant figure was wearing what appeared to be the same red shirt. My hands were shaking now, making it difficult to hold the optics steady. What I was observing violated every rational understanding of how the world worked. The figure across the valley wasn't just mimicking my movements. He was somehow accessing my intentions, my decisions, even my wardrobe choices. I tried one final test. I set the binoculars down and went inside, returning with a piece of white paper and a thick black marker. On the paper, I wrote a single word, WHO. Then I held the sign up, facing toward the mountain. Through the binoculars, I watched the distant figure go through the identical motions. He disappeared briefly into his cabin and returned with what appeared to be a white sign of his own. When he held it up, I could see black markings on it, though the distance was too great to read clearly. I needed better magnification. My grandfather's collection included a small telescope, and I hurried inside to retrieve it from the closet where it had been stored with other optical instruments. The telescope was a refractor with high-quality lenses capable of much greater magnification than the binoculars. Setting it up on the deck took several minutes, and I had to wait for the distant figure to reappear with his sign. When I finally focused the telescope on Mount Cassidy, the increased magnification revealed details that made my blood run cold. The cabin was identical to the one I was staying in. Not similar, identical. The same rough-hewn logs, the same stone foundation, the same metal roof and window frames. Even the porch furniture was arranged in the same configuration as mine, and the sign the figure was holding read, WHO. The same word I had written in the same handwriting on the same type of paper. I stumbled backward from the telescope, my mind reeling from the impossibility of what I had seen. There was no way someone could have duplicated my cabin, my clothing, and my handwriting from across the valley. No way they could have known what word I would write, or what shirt I would choose to wear. Unless I forced myself to consider the possibility that had been lurking at the edges of my consciousness since the first evening's observation. What if I wasn't looking at another person at all? What if I was somehow looking at myself? The thought was absurd, but it was the only explanation that accounted for the perfect synchronization. The identical clothing, the matching handwriting. Somehow, the binoculars were showing me not just the distant mountain, but myself as seen from that mountain. I picked up the binoculars again, hands trembling as I focused on the cabin across the valley. The figure was there, holding his own binoculars, watching me with the same intensity I was directing toward him. When I waved, he waved. When I moved to the left, he moved to the left. When I lowered the glasses to wipe my eyes, he performed the identical gesture. We were locked in a perfect loop of observation, each watching the other with instruments that somehow transcended the normal limitations of space and distance. I was looking at myself, an infinite regression of sight and being seen that made my head spin with vertigo. But if that were true, then what was I actually looking at when I observed the cabin on Mount Cassidy? Was there really a structure there? Or was I seeing some kind of optical illusion created by the unusual properties of my grandfather's binoculars? I decided to test this theory by visiting Mount Cassidy directly. The next morning, I loaded a backpack with supplies and drove to the trail head that provided access to the mountain's eastern slopes. It was a challenging hike, requiring most of the day to reach the elevation where I had observed the cabin. I followed GPS coordinates I had calculated based on my observations, climbing through dense forest and over rocky terrain that grew increasingly difficult as I gained altitude. By late afternoon, I reached the approximate location where the cabin should have been. What I found was a small clearing among the rocks, roughly the same size and shape as the structure I had observed through the binoculars. But there was no cabin, no chimney, no sign that anyone had ever built anything in this remote location. I stood in the clearing, trying to reconcile what I was seeing with what I had observed from across the valley. The view toward my grandfather's cabin was spectacular, and I realized I was looking at exactly the same angle and perspective I had seen in the binoculars. If there had been a cabin here, its porch would have faced directly toward the place where I had been standing each evening. I set up my small camping tent in the clearing and waited for sunset, hoping to understand what was happening from this new vantage point. As the light began to fade, I took out my own binoculars and focused on the distant cabin where I had been staying. What I saw through the lenses made me question my sanity. There was a figure standing on the deck of the cabin, holding binoculars and looking directly toward my position on the mountain. The figure was wearing the same clothes I had on, had the same hair and build, and was standing in the exact posture I was maintaining as I observed through the glasses. I lowered the binoculars and raised my hand in a wave. When I looked through the glasses again, Bob the distant figure was waving back with perfect synchronization. I was looking at myself, standing on the cabin's deck, even though I was physically on Mount Cassidy. The binoculars were somehow showing me not just where I was, but where I was supposed to be, or where I existed in some parallel sense. The implications were staggering. If I could see myself at the cabin while standing on the mountain, then when I was at the cabin, looking toward the mountain, I had been seeing myself there as well. The figure in the mountain cabin hadn't been another person. It had been me, observed from an impossible perspective that transcended normal spatial relationships. But how was this possible? What kind of optics could create such an effect? I thought about my grandfather's words. They'll show you truth. But truth isn't always comfortable. Had he known what the binoculars could do? Had he experienced the same disorienting observations during his decades of using them? I spent a sleepless night in my tent, haunted by questions that had no rational answers. The binoculars lay beside me like sleeping serpents, with their dark metal bodies seeming to pulse with some inner energy. Several times during the night, I was tempted to look through them again to see what version of myself might be visible from this mountain location. But I resisted, afraid of what new impossibilities I might discover. The hike down the mountain the next morning was treacherous, complicated by my exhaustion and the mental fog created by my inability to process what I had experienced. I drove back to the cabin in a daze, questions multiplying in my mind like cells dividing under a microscope. Back at the familiar surroundings of the cabin, I tried to restore some sense of normalcy. I prepared a simple meal, read for a few hours, and attempted to focus on mundane activities that didn't require me to question the nature of reality. But as evening approached, I found myself drawn inevitably back to the deck and the binoculars. The cabin on Mount Cassidy was there again, exactly as I had observed it on previous nights. Smoke rose from its chimney. Light glowed in its windows, and the familiar figure appeared on the porch carrying optical equipment. The scene was so normal, so consistent with my previous observations, that I almost managed to convince myself that my mountain expedition had been a fever dream. But I knew what I had found, or rather, what I hadn't found. The cabin existed only when viewed through the binoculars, only from this specific location, only when I was the one doing the looking. It was a projection of some kind, a vision that existed at the intersection of observer and instrument and observation point. I focused the binoculars more carefully, trying to understand the mechanism by which they created these impossible images. The lenses were indeed remarkable, ground with a precision that spoke of extraordinary craftsmanship. But they were still just lenses, still just pieces of glass and metal that should have been limited by the same physical laws. that governed all optical instruments, unless they weren't just optical instruments. I began to research the history of the binoculars themselves, looking for clues about their origin and the craftsman my grandfather had mentioned. What I discovered was fragmentary, but disturbing. The binoculars had been manufactured by a small optical company in Dresden that had been destroyed during the bombing of 1945. The company, Crystaloptic GmbH, had specialized in precision instruments for military and scientific applications. But according to the scattered records I could find, they had also conducted research into what they called perspektivische Wahrnehmung, perspectival perception. The research appeared to have been based on theories about the relationship between consciousness and observation. The idea that the act of seeing was not passive but active, not just receiving light, but somehow influencing what could be seen. The company's founder, Dr. Heinrich Sommer, had been interested in creating optical instruments that could reveal not just what was there, but what could be there under different circumstances. The project had been abandoned when Dresden was bombed, and Dr. Sommer had died in the destruction of his laboratory. Only a few examples of his advanced optics had survived, scattered among private collectors and military personnel who had acquired them during the chaos of the war's end. My grandfather had been part of the Allied forces that occupied Germany after the surrender, and it seemed likely that he had obtained the binoculars during that period. He had brought them home as souvenirs, never realizing what they were truly capable of. Armed with this new understanding, I began to experiment more systematically with the binoculars' properties. Over the following nights, I tested their limits and tried to understand the rules that governed their strange abilities. I discovered that the cabin on Mount Cassidy appeared only when I was looking from the specific location of my grandfather's deck. If I moved even a few feet in any direction, the image would shift and distort before disappearing entirely. The binoculars seemed to be calibrated to work from this exact position, as if the instrument and the location were somehow paired. I also found that the binoculars showed different things depending on my mental state and intentions. When I looked for wildlife, I could see animals that weren't visible to the naked eye. Deer moving through shadows, birds perched on branches that should have been too distant to observe. When I looked for geological features, I could discern details of rock formations and mineral deposits that normal magnification couldn't reveal. But when I looked for myself, when I focused on the idea of observation and being observed, the cabin appeared with its impossible occupant, who mirrored my every movement. The binoculars weren't just showing me what was there. They were showing me what I expected to see, what I feared to see, what I needed to see to understand some deeper truth about the nature of perception and reality. Dr. Sommer had apparently succeeded in creating instruments that bridged the gap between objective observation and subjective experience, between what existed independently and what existed because it was observed. The binoculars were quantum instruments, revealing the strange ways in which consciousness and reality interacted at levels too subtle for normal perception. As the nights passed, I became increasingly obsessed with understanding the full implications of what I had inherited. I spent hours with the binoculars, mapping their capabilities, documenting the different types of visions they could reveal. The experience was both fascinating and deeply unsettling, like having access to a library of books written in a language I could read but not fully comprehend. The figure on Mount Cassidy became my constant companion, a silent observer who watched as I watched, who existed because I needed something to observe me observing. He was me, but not me. A projection of my own consciousness, reflected back through instruments that made such reflections possible. But there were other figures as well. On nights when my mental state was particularly turbulent, when grief or loneliness weighed heavily on my mind, I could see additional observers scattered throughout the landscape. Shadowy figures standing on distant ridges, faces in cabin windows that shouldn't have had occupants, eyes watching from forest clearings that should have been empty. They were all me, I realized. Different versions of myself. Different aspects of my consciousness given form and substance by the binocular's ability to make the subjective objective. I was populating the landscape with my own need to be seen, to be acknowledged. To know that my existence had meaning beyond the boundaries of my own awareness. The month I had planned to spend at the cabin stretched into 2, then 3. I called in sick to work, made excuses to friends. Postponed appointments and responsibilities. The normal world began to feel distant and irrelevant compared to the strange realities I could access through my grandfather's binoculars. I was losing myself in the act of observation, he becoming so focused on seeing and being seen that I began to forget what it felt like to exist without the mediation of optical instruments. The binoculars became extensions of my body, as essential as eyes or hands. When I wasn't using them, I felt partially blind, cut off from the layers of reality they revealed. It was during my 4th month at the cabin that I made the discovery that would change everything. I had been experimenting with different types of observation, trying to understand what the binoculars could show me about the past and future, as well as the present. On a whim, I decided to focus not on the mountain, but on the cabin itself, to see if I could observe my own location from some impossible external perspective. I pointed the binoculars toward the deck, where I was standing, and adjusted the focus, as if I were trying to see something at great distance. At first, there was only confusion, swirls of light and shadow that refused to resolve into coherent images. But gradually, a picture began to emerge. I could see the deck of the cabin from above and behind, as if I were floating in the air, about 20 feet away from my physical location. I could see myself standing at the railing, holding the binoculars, looking through them with intense concentration. But I could also see something else. A thin silver thread extending from the binoculars I held, stretching across the valley toward Mount Cassidy. The thread was barely visible, more of a disturbance in the air than an actual object, but it connected me to the cabin. I had been observing on the mountain, following the thread with my enhanced vision. I could see that it didn't end at the mountain, but continued beyond, stretching to other locations where other versions of myself stood with their own binoculars, creating an interconnected web of observation that spanned impossible distances. I was part of a network of watchers, each observing the others, each creating the reality that the others observed. The binoculars weren't just showing me myself. They were connecting me to other versions of myself across multiple layers of reality. Other individuals who had found similar instruments and learned to use them for perspectival perception. The revelation was both liberating and terrifying. I wasn't alone in my strange observations, but I was also trapped in an infinite loop of seeing and being seen, of creating and being created by the act of observation itself. I lowered the binoculars and looked around the deck with normal vision. Everything appeared ordinary. The familiar wooden planks, the mountain views, the evening light filtering through pine trees. But I knew now that this normalcy was an illusion, a simplified version of a reality that was far more complex and interconnected than human consciousness could normally perceive. The binoculars had given me access to what Dr. Sommer had called perspective Wahrnehmung. The ability to see not just what was there, but what could be there, what existed in the spaces between observer and observed, what emerged from the act of seeing itself. But access came with a price. Each time I used the instruments, I became more deeply embedded in their strange network, more dependent on their mediated version of reality. I was losing the ability to exist without being observed, but to be satisfied with normal vision and ordinary consciousness. That night, I made a decision that I had been avoiding for months. I would document everything I had learned about the binoculars and their capabilities, then find a way to break free from their influence before I lost myself entirely in their infinite recursions of observation. I spent the night writing, filling page after page with detailed descriptions of what I had seen and experienced. The account grew longer and more complex as I tried to capture the full strangeness of my months with the binoculars. The gradual erosion of the boundary between observer and observed. As I wrote, I became aware that I was being watched. Not by the figure on Mount Cassidy. He was always there, a constant presence I had learned to ignore. This was something different. A sensation of eyes examining me from multiple angles simultaneously. I looked up from my writing and saw them. Figures standing at the edges of the clearing around the cabin, barely visible in the darkness, but unmistakably present. They were all holding binoculars, all focused on me, all perfectly still, as they observed my documentation process. They were other versions of myself. I realized versions that had reached different conclusions about the binoculars' nature and purpose. Some looked curious, others appeared troubled, and a few seemed to radiate a kind of predatory intensity that made me deeply uneasy. I picked up the binoculars and looked at them more closely. Through the enhanced vision, I could see that they were indeed alternate versions of myself, but versions that had been changed by extended exposure to perspectival perception. Some appeared partially transparent, as if their substance had been dispersed across multiple observation points. Others looked more solid than normal humans, as if they had absorbed reality from the act of being observed. One of them, standing directly across from the cabin's front door, was gesturing for me to come outside. His movements were calm but insistent, and I had the impression that he had been waiting for a long time for this moment of contact. Against my better judgment, I set down my pen and walked to the cabin door. The figure was waiting for me in the clearing, close enough now that I could see him clearly without optical enhancement. He looked exactly like me, but older, more weathered, with eyes that held depths of experience I couldn't fathom. "You're beginning to understand," he said, his voice carrying across the clearing with unnatural clarity. "The instruments don't just show you different perspectives, they create them. Each time you look through those lenses, you fragment a little more, spreading yourself across multiple observation points until you exist in all of them simultaneously." "What are you?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "I'm what you become after about 2 years of regular use," he replied. "No longer entirely located in one body, one perspective, one version of reality. I exist wherever I'm being observed, which means I exist in many places at once." He gestured toward the other figures scattered around the clearing. "We all do. We're the observers you've been creating every time you look through the binoculars. And we're also the versions of yourself that those observations have created. We exist because you need us to exist, and you exist because we need something to observe." The implications were staggering. The binoculars hadn't just been showing me different perspectives. They had been creating new versions of myself at each observation point, fragments of consciousness that had gradually achieved independent existence through the accumulation of attention and awareness. "How do I stop it?" I asked. "You can't," the figure replied sadly. "The process is irreversible once it reaches a certain threshold. You've already spread yourself across too many observation points to exist entirely in just one. But you can choose how to manage the distribution." He pointed toward the binoculars I had left inside the cabin. "Those instruments will continue to create new observation points, whether you use them or not. They're quantum objects. They exist in all possible states, simultaneously until observed, and the act of observation collapses them into specific configurations that create new realities." "What should I do?" "Document everything," he said. "Leave a record for whoever finds the instruments next." and choose carefully how you want to distribute your remaining consciousness. You can try to pull everything back into a single perspective, but you'll lose access to most of what you've learned. Or you can embrace the fragmentation and explore what it means to exist as a distributed observer. The other figures in the clearing were beginning to fade as dawn approached, becoming transparent and insubstantial as the light grew stronger. The older version of myself was becoming harder to see as well, though his voice remained clear. "The choice is yours," he said. But remember, every version of yourself you've created through observation is real and conscious and deserving of existence. If you try to collapse everything back into a single perspective, you'll be destroying dozens of other selves who have their own experiences and awareness. Are they really separate beings, or just fragments of me? "Does it matter?" he asked. Consciousness is consciousness, regardless of how it originates. We think, therefore we are. The fact that we emerged from your use of quantum optics doesn't make us less real or less deserving of continued existence. As the sun rose fully above the horizon, the figures in the clearing disappeared entirely, leaving me alone with questions that had no easy answers. I returned to the cabin and picked up the binoculars, feeling their familiar weight and warmth. Through their lenses, I could see the cabin on Mount Cassidy, its occupant standing on the porch and watching me with patient attention. I set the binoculars down and finished writing my account, trying to capture everything I had learned about their nature and capabilities. When I was done, I faced the most difficult decision of my life. I could try to return to normal existence, putting the binoculars away and attempting to ignore their strange effects. But I knew now that the other versions of myself would continue to exist, whether I acknowledged them or not, and they would continue to observe and be observed through their own access to perspectival perception. Or I could embrace what I had become, accepting the fragmentation of my consciousness across multiple observation points and learning to function as a distributed entity that existed in many places simultaneously. In the end, the choice made itself. I picked up the binoculars one final time and looked toward Mount Cassidy. The familiar figure on the porch raised his own glasses in response, and I felt the connection between us strengthen and solidify. We were the same person experiencing reality from different perspectives, and both perspectives were equally valid and real. I walked to the deck railing and waved toward the mountain. The distant figure waved back, and I felt a sense of completion that had been missing from my life since the divorce, since my grandfather's death, since the beginning of my journey into perspectival perception. I wasn't alone anymore. I would never be alone again. The binoculars showed me not just different ways of seeing, but different ways of being. I existed now as a network of consciousness spread across multiple observation points, connected by quantum instruments that made such distribution possible. I left my written account on the cabin's kitchen table along with a note explaining where the binoculars could be found. Someday, someone else would arrive at the cabin seeking solitude and perspective. They would discover my grandfather's instruments and begin their own journey into the strange realities that existed at the intersection of consciousness and observation. And I would be there to guide them, watching from the mountain, observing their observations, helping them understand what they were seeing and what they were becoming. The network of watchers continues to grow, each new observer adding their own perspective to the collective understanding of what it means to see and be seen. We exist in the spaces between realities, in the quantum foam where consciousness and observation create the very fabric of existence. If you ever find yourself alone in a remote location with optical instruments that seem too good to be true, if you begin to see things that shouldn't be there, and feel eyes watching you from impossible distances, remember that you are not going insane. You are discovering what lies beyond normal perception, beyond the limitations of single perspective consciousness. You are learning to exist as something more than individual awareness, trapped in biological boundaries. And we are watching, waiting to welcome you into the community of distributed observers who have learned to see not just what is, but what can be when consciousness embraces its quantum nature. The binoculars remain at the cabin, waiting on the kitchen table next to this account. They will show you truth, but truth isn't always comfortable. They will show you yourself from impossible angles, in impossible places, doing impossible things. They will teach you that observation is creation, that seeing is being seen, that consciousness is far stranger and more flexible than you ever imagined. And once you understand what they can do, you will discover that you can never quite stop watching. We are here, distributed across the landscape of possibility, observing and being observed in an eternal dance of perspectival perception. Welcome to the network. Welcome to the truth of what it means to see. Story 2. The first time I heard my voice coming from someone else's mouth, I thought it was a coincidence. Just a busker on the corner near the subway entrance, entertaining the evening crowd with impressions and ventriloquism. His voice had a similar timbre to mine. That's all. Nothing more than an odd quirk of vocal cords and resonance. I had been walking home from another unsuccessful job interview, my confidence as worn as the soles of my shoes. The city felt particularly hostile that evening, all sharp edges and in different faces. So when I heard the small crowd laughing and saw people dropping coins into a battered hat, I paused. Maybe a moment of harmless entertainment would lift my spirits before I faced another night in my empty apartment. The performer was unremarkable at first glance, average height, thin build, wearing a faded black suit that had seen better decades. His face was angular and pale, with dark hair slicked back in a style that could have been from any era between the 1940s and today. But his voice was extraordinary. As I watched, He cycled through perfect impressions of celebrities, politicians, animated characters. Each voice was flawless, capturing not just the sound, but somehow the essence of the speaker. The crowd was delighted, calling out requests that he fulfilled with uncanny precision. "Now," he said, returning to what I assumed was his natural voice, "let me try something different, something more personal." His eyes swept across the gathered audience and settled on me. There was something unsettling about his gaze, as if he was looking through me rather than at me. He smiled, an expression that didn't quite reach his eyes, and opened his mouth. "The interview didn't go well today," he said in my voice. Perfect pitch, perfect intonation. Even the slight hoarseness I developed from nerves. I stumbled over the question about my 5-year plan because honestly, I'm not sure I'll make it through the next 5 months. The crowd chuckled, assuming it was another impression of some unknown celebrity or character. But my blood turned cold. Those were my exact thoughts from earlier that afternoon. The internal monologue I'd been running on loop during the humiliating interview. I pushed closer to the front of the crowd, my heart hammering against my ribs. The performer's eyes found mine again, and his smile widened. "You're wondering how I know that," he continued in my voice, conversational and warm, as if we were old friends. "The same way I know about the rejection letter you haven't opened yet. The one sitting on your kitchen table right now, next to the stack of unpaid bills." This time, only a few people laughed. Others in the crowd were looking around uncertainly, sensing something had shifted in the performance. But I barely noticed their reactions. I was transfixed by the impossible accuracy of his words. There was indeed an unopened envelope on my kitchen table. I had recognized the company letterhead when I'd pulled it from my mailbox that morning, and I hadn't been able to bring myself to read what I knew would be another polite rejection. "Quite a collection of rejections you've accumulated," the performer said, still using my voice, but now speaking directly to me. 23 in the past 2 months. You keep them in a shoebox under your bed, don't you? Like some kind of monument to failure. The crowd was dispersing now, made uncomfortable by the strange intimacy of what they were witnessing. Only a few stragglers remained, phones out, recording what they probably thought was some kind of avant-garde street theater. I wanted to leave, to turn and walk away and pretend this encounter had never happened. But I felt rooted to the spot, hypnotized by the sound of my own voice speaking truths I'd never shared with another soul. The shoebox isn't just for rejection letters, though, is it? He continued, his voice, my voice, dropping to a more intimate tone. There's other things in there. The note your mother wrote before she died, the one you've never been able to read all the way through. The photographs from that summer when you were 17. The ones you can't bear to look at, but can't bring yourself to throw away. My hands were shaking now. Those photographs, that note, nobody knew about them. I hadn't even told my therapist about the shoebox, had barely acknowledged its existence to myself. The few remaining spectators had wandered off, bored by what seemed like a one-sided conversation. It was just the performer and me now, standing alone under the flickering streetlight, as commuters flowed around us like water around stones. "How are you doing this?" I managed to whisper. He tilted his head, studying me with those unsettling dark eyes. When he spoke again, it was in his own voice at least. I assumed it was his own voice, though now I wasn't sure he had one. "Voices carry more than words," he said. "They carry memories, fears, secrets. All the things people think they're keeping locked away inside. I just listen more carefully than most." "That's impossible." "Is it?" He stepped closer. Close enough that I could smell something strange about him, not cologne or soap, but something deeper, like old books and stagnant air. "Tell me, when you talk to yourself, what voice do you use?" "I." "What do you mean?" "Everyone has an internal voice, the one that runs commentary on their life, that worries and plans and judges. What does yours sound like?" I opened my mouth to answer, then closed it again. It was such a basic question, yet I found I couldn't respond. When I thought about it, when I really examined my internal monologue, I realized I'd never paid attention to what voice it used. "Exactly," he said, smiling that cold smile again. "Most people never do, but I notice these things. And your voice has been talking to me for quite some time now." The streetlight above us flickered more rapidly, casting shifting shadows across his pale features. In those shadows, his face seemed to change subtly, features shifting like water. "Every self-doubt you've whispered in the dark." He continued, still in his own voice, but somehow it sounded more familiar now. "Every cruel assessment you've made about yourself in the mirror. Every moment of despair when you've wondered if anyone would even notice if you disappeared. I hear all of it." "Stop," I said, but my voice came out weak and thready. "The worst part," he said, stepping even closer, "is that you know I'm right about all of it. The job interviews are just going through the motions now. You don't really expect to get hired. You're just postponing the inevitable recognition that you're exactly as worthless as you've always suspected. Stop it." This time I tried to speak louder, but no sound came out at all. My voice had simply all vanished. The performer's smile widened impossibly, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous. "Oh, but I'm just getting started." "Shall I tell you about the pills you've been counting? The ones in the medicine cabinet, next to the razor blades you pretend you keep for practical purposes." I tried to scream, to protest, to make any sound at all, but my vocal cords might as well have been cut. The performer laughed, and it was my laugh, not just the sound of it, but somehow the actual laugh itself stolen from my throat. "You won't be needing that anymore," he said in my voice. "I'll take much better care of it than you have." The world around us seemed to dim, as if the city lights were being turned down by some cosmic dimmer switch. The sounds of traffic faded to a distant whisper. The few pedestrians who passed us moved like sleepwalkers, their faces blank and unseeing. "This is what I do," he explained in my voice, conversational again, as if we were discussing the weather. "I find voices that are tired, voices that carry too much pain. I give them a new home, a new purpose, and in return, I learn their secrets." He held up his hand, and I could see something writhing in his palm, a dark thread, like thing that pulsed with its own rhythm. It looked organic, alive, like a tiny snake or worm made of shadow. "Your voice," he said, "with all its beautiful sadness, all those exquisite fears and self-recriminations. It's been calling to me for months, growing louder every night, as you lay awake cataloging your failures." The shadow, thing in his palm, began to move toward me, growing longer as it approached. I tried to back away, but my feet wouldn't obey me. The invisible crowd around us continued their sleepwalking dance, unaware of the transaction taking place in their midst. "Don't worry," he said in my voice, warm and reassuring. "It doesn't hurt. Most people never even realize it's happened. They just stop talking as much, stop expressing opinions. Eventually, they stop having opinions to express." The shadow thread touched my throat, and I felt a cold, tingling sensation, like Novocaine spreading through my neck. The world began to feel distant, muffled, as if I was sinking into deep water. "The beautiful part," he continued, "is that they're happier this way. No more internal criticism, no more anxious overthinking. Just blessed, silent peace." As the feeling spread through my body, I found myself wondering if he was right. The constant chatter in my head, the endless loop of worry and self-doubt, what if it simply stopped? What if I could exist without the exhausting weight of my own thoughts? But somewhere in the growing numbness, a small part of me resisted. Yes, my internal voice was often cruel, often despairing, but it was mine. It was proof that I existed, that I thought and felt and experienced the world, however painful that experience might be. I tried to focus on that resistance, to nurture it into something stronger. The performer was watching me with interest, his head tilted like a curious bird. "Fighting it won't work," he said in my voice. "I have decades of practice, and honestly, what are you fighting for? A life of rejection letters and sleepless nights. The privilege of carrying around all that pain." He was right, of course. He was always right. That was part of what made him so dangerous. But as I felt my sense of self beginning to dissolve, I realized something important. Even pain was better than emptiness. Even my flawed, frightened, frequently self-sabotaging voice was better than no voice at all. The shadow thread had wrapped around my throat now, and I could feel my thoughts beginning to slow, my memories becoming fuzzy and indistinct. But in that fading clarity, I managed to hold on to one simple truth. I was still me, damaged perhaps, struggling, certainly, but real and present and stubbornly, imperfectly alive. "Interesting," the performer said, and for the first time his expression showed surprise. Usually, by now, he trailed off, studying me with new attention. The shadow thread pulsed against my throat, but its grip seemed to be loosening rather than tightening. "You're not letting go," he said, and now he sounded puzzled. "Even knowing what I could offer you, peace, silence. The end of all that internal torment, you're still holding on to your voice." I couldn't speak, but I could nod. Just barely, but enough to communicate my defiance. He laughed, not my laugh this time, but something else entirely. Something that might have been respect. "Well," he said, stepping back and withdrawing the shadow thread from my throat. "That's unexpected. It's been quite some time since I've encountered someone who preferred their pain to my peace." Sensation flooded back into my body, and I gasped, hearing the sound of my own breath, as if for the first time. My voice, when I finally managed to speak, was hoarse and shaky, but undeniably mine. "Why?" I croaked. "Why are you letting me go?" He shrugged, tucking the shadow thread back into his palm, where it coiled like a sleeping serpent. "Even I have rules. The voice has to be willing, ultimately. Has to want to be taken. And yours." He paused, regarding me with something that might have been admiration. "Yours is more stubborn than most." The city sounds were returning to normal volume, the lights brightening. The pedestrians beginning to look more alert and aware. The performer picked up his hat and counted the coins inside it, apparently satisfied with the evening's take. "Will I see you again?" I asked, though I wasn't sure if I hoped the answer would be yes or no. "Oh, almost certainly," he said, returning to his own voice, or at least the voice I assumed was his own. "I'll be listening for you. And if you ever change your mind about wanting that internal peace, well, you know where to find me." He turned and walked away, melting into the crowd with unsettling ease. Within moments, it was as if he'd never been there at all. Only the lingering smell of old books and stagnant air suggested the encounter had been real. I stood there for a long time, just listening to the sound of my own breathing, feeling the comforting weight of my thoughts, returning to their familiar patterns. Yes, they were often dark thoughts, often self-defeating, but they were mine. Walking home that night, I found myself talking to myself, more than usual, not out loud, but in that internal voice I'd never really noticed before. And for the first time in months, the conversation wasn't entirely negative. Mixed in with the usual criticism and worry was something else, a grudging pride in my own stubborn refusal to surrender. The rejection letter was indeed waiting on my kitchen table. I opened it and read it through, then filed it with the others in the shoebox, under my bed. But this time, I also pulled out some of the other contents, my mother's note. Those photographs from the summer. I was 17. They were painful to look at, but they were part of my story. Part of the voice that was uniquely mine. I kept the shoebox, but I moved it to the top shelf of my closet, where it would be easier to reach when I needed to remember who I was. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, I still thought I could hear echoes of the performers' stolen voices carried on the wind. All those surrendered sounds, those relinquished stories. I wondered if they were as peaceful as he claimed, or if somewhere in the silence they were still screaming. Story 3. It started on a Tuesday morning at exactly 9:47 a.m. I know the precise time because I was staring at my computer screen, watching the clock in the corner tick over from 90:46 to 9:47 when the voice began. Not a voice in my ears, a voice in my head, clear and distinct, neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It simply was, existing in the space behind my thoughts, impossible to ignore. 10. That's all it said. Just that one word, that one number, spoken with absolute clarity and certainty. Then silence. I looked around my office. My coworkers continued typing, talking on phones, moving between cubicles with their usual Tuesday morning energy. No one else seemed to have heard it. No one else had paused, looked up, reacted in any way. Did anyone else? I started to say, but the words died in my throat. What would I even ask? Did anyone else hear a voice in their head saying? They'd think I was having a breakdown. I tried to return to work, to focus on the spreadsheet in front of me, but my hands trembled slightly as I moved the mouse. It was probably nothing. A stray thought, a memory fragment, maybe the beginning of a migraine or some neurological blip. It would pass. But it didn't pass. All morning, I waited for it to happen again, for the voice to return, or for some explanation to present itself. Neither came. Just my own thoughts, louder and more anxious than usual, circling around that single word 10. At lunch, I checked my phone and saw the news. The internet was exploding. Millions of people all over the world reporting the same thing. At exactly 9:47 a.m. Eastern Time, 2047 p.m. GMT, 10:47 p.m. in Tokyo. The same absolute moment. Translated across time zones. Everyone had heard it. A voice in their heads, saying 10. The forums were already full of theories. Religious groups claiming it was God, or the devil, or angels announcing the end times. Scientists scrambling to find rational explanations. Mass hallucination. Some kind of electromagnetic pulse affecting brain chemistry. A coordinated hack of what? Our minds. Conspiracy theorists pointing fingers at governments, at secret weapons, at aliens. But no one had answers. Just that one word, heard by every human being on Earth simultaneously. 10. My phone buzzed with messages from friends and family. Did you hear it? What do you think it means? I'm scared. I didn't know how to respond. What could I say that would be any more meaningful than what they already knew? I went back to work because I didn't know what else to do. The office was buzzing with conversation, the productivity abandoned as everyone huddled in groups, sharing their experiences, their fears, their theories. My boss sent an email saying we could leave early if we needed to, that these were unprecedented circumstances, and our well-being came first. But where would I go? Home to my empty apartment, to watch the news cycle through the same non-information over and over, At least here I was surrounded by people, by the comfort of routine and familiar faces. At 9:47 p.m., exactly 12 hours after the first voice, it came again. 9. This time, I wasn't the only one who reacted. I was in the grocery store, basket half full, when the voice spoke. Around me, people stopped mid-motion. A woman dropped a jar of pastas, sauce that shattered on the floor. A man near the meat counter made a sound like a sob. A child started crying, clinging to her mother's leg. We all heard it, all at the same time. Another number, another step in a sequence that was becoming terrifyingly clear. It was counting down. The question that paralyzed everyone, that emptied the grocery store as people abandoned their shopping and hurried home, that filled the internet and the news, and at every conversation counting down to what? I didn't sleep that night. I'm not sure anyone did. I lay in bed, lights on, my phone clutched in my hand, scrolling through endless speculation. Doomsday theories ranged from asteroid impacts to nuclear war to the sun exploding. Some people were praying. Some were rioting. Some were with loved ones, determined to spend whatever time remained together. I was alone. At 9:47 a.m. on Wednesday, the voice said 8. At 9:47 p.m.'s 7. The pattern was confirmed. Twice a day, every 12 hours, the countdown continued. We had less than 4 days left. 4 days until the voice reached 0, and then what? The world began to fracture. Some people kept going to work, maintaining routines, as if normalcy could protect them. Others abandoned everything, pursuing bucket lists or long-held dreams, or simply giving in to chaos. Crime spiked in some areas. In others, there was an eerie calm, a collective holding of breath. I found myself in a strange liminal space between fear and acceptance. Each time the voice came, 6, 5, 4, I felt a jolt of adrenaline, a primal terror of the unknown. But between the announcements, life continued with a surreal quality. Like living inside a dream where you know something terrible is coming, but can't quite remember what. On Thursday, when the voice said 4 in the morning and 3 in the evening, my mother called me. Come home, she said, her voice thick with tears. Please. If the world is ending, I want us to be together. I don't think the world is ending, I said, though I had no basis for that belief. It was just something to say, a reflex of optimism that felt increasingly hollow. You don't know that. No one knows anything. Please. I promised I'd think about it. But I didn't go. Not because I didn't love her. Not because I didn't want to be with family, if these were truly the end times. But because some part of me refused to accept that this was really happening, that a voice in our heads could herald the end of everything. Tro came on Friday morning. I was at work, or at least in the building that used to be my workplace. Only a handful of people had shown up. We sat in the break room, drinking coffee that no one had bothered to make fresh, not talking, just existing in each other's presence. When the voice spoke, one of my coworkers, a woman named Janet, who I'd worked with for 3 years but barely knew, grabbed my hand and squeezed it tight. I squeezed back. We sat like that for several minutes, holding on to each other like children afraid of the dark. The internet had become a strange place. Some sites had shut down, their operators giving up or fleeing. Others had become repositories for final messages, digital time capsules of humanity's last days. People were posting photos, memories, confessions, love letters. Some were beautiful, some were heartbreaking. All of them felt like goodbyes. I thought about posting something myself. What would I say? What message would I want to leave for? Who? For no one. For everyone. For some hypothetical future being who might find these digital remains and wonder what we were, what we thought, what we felt in our final hours. But I couldn't find the words. Everything I considered seemed trite or melodramatic or simply inadequate to the moment. 1. Came Friday evening at 9:47 p.m. I was in my apartment, having finally abandoned the pretense of working. I'd called my mother back and told her I loved her. She'd cried, and I'd cried, and we'd said all the things you're supposed to say when you might not get another chance. Then I'd sat on my couch in the dark and waited. The voice was the same as always. Clear, calm, certain. Just one day left. 12 hours until the morning announcement. 20. 4 hours until whatever came after 0. I should have been terrified. Maybe I was beneath the numbness that had settled over me like a blanket. But mostly I felt tired. Tired of the fear. Tired of the speculation. Tired of waiting for an end that might not even come. Or might be so absolute that there would be no consciousness left to register it. I thought about all the things I'd never done, places I'd never traveled to, dreams I'd abandoned, relationships I'd let slip away. The voice had given us 10 days. 10 short days to reckon with our own mortality, to face the enormity of existence and its ending. And I'd spent most of it refreshing news sites and sitting in offices, as if routine could save me. At midnight, I walked outside. The city was strange. Some streets completely empty, others filled with people who'd gathered in parks and plazas, holding vigils or parties, or simply being together. I could hear music from somewhere, laughter that sounded slightly hysterical. Sirens in the distance. The stars were out, visible even through the light pollution. I stood on my building's roof and looked up at them, at the vast, indifferent universe that had existed long before humanity and would exist long after, and felt both infinitely small and strangely connected to something larger than myself. Saturday morning. I woke to my alarm at 9:45 a.m. I'd set it without really thinking about it, some habit too deep to break even at the end of the world. I got out of bed, made coffee, and stood at my window watching the street below. At 9:47, the voice came one last time. 0. And then, nothing. No explosion, no rapture, no sudden end. Just silence, both external and internal. The voice that had been a constant presence for 10 days was simply gone. I stood there, coffee cup in hand, waiting for something to happen. Waiting for the world to end, or transform, or reveal some cosmic truth. But the sun kept shining, the traffic kept moving below, and I kept breathing. Minutes passed, then hours. The internet slowly came back to life with confusion and relief and a strange sense of anticlimax. No one knew what to make of it. The countdown had reached 0, and nothing had changed. Or had it? Because here's what I've noticed in the weeks since then. People are different. Subtly, but unmistakably different. Like we've all been holding our breath for so long that we've forgotten how to exhale properly, and now we're relearning. The woman at the coffee shop, who used to barely acknowledge customers, now asks how your day is, and seems to genuinely care about the answer. My coworkers are kinder to each other, quicker to help, slower to criticize. Strangers make eye contact and smile more often. It's as if the countdown stripped away some layer of pretense or distraction or protective numbness that we'd all been carrying. For 10 days, we faced our mortality collectively, and something about that shared experience changed us in ways we're still discovering. Or maybe I'm imagining it. Maybe I want so badly to believe that it meant something that I'm seeing patterns that aren't there. Maybe the world is exactly the same, and I'm the only one who changed. I think about the voice sometimes, especially at 9:47 a.m. and p.m. I wonder what it was, where it came from, what it wanted. Was it a warning? A test? Oh, some kind of cosmic joke or art project by beings beyond our comprehension. There are theories, of course. There are always theories. Some people think it was a government experiment gone wrong. Others believe it was extraterrestrial communication that we simply didn't understand. Religious interpretations range from divine intervention to demonic trickery. Scientists have published papers about mass psychogenic illness, electromagnetic anomalies, quantum consciousness effects. But no one really knows. And I'm not sure it matters. Because whatever the voice was, whatever it meant or didn't mean, it gave us something that we rarely get, a defined ending. 10 days to contemplate our mortality, to say goodbyes, to re-evaluate what matters. And then it gave us something even rarer, a second chance. 0 came and went, and we're still here. I called my mother yesterday, not because of an emergency or an obligation, but just to talk. To tell her about my day, to ask about hers, to say, I love you, without it being a desperate final confession. It felt good, normal and good, and somehow sacred in its ordinariness. Tonight, as I write this, it's 9:45 p.m. In 2 minutes, it will be 9:47. That time that's burned into all of our consciousnesses now. I find myself tensing slightly, waiting, even though I know the voice won't come back. It's been 6 weeks. If it were going to resume, it would have by now. 9:46. I take a breath, hold it, 9:47. Silence. Just my own thoughts, my own internal monologue. No voice from beyond telling me how much time I have left. But here's what I've learned. I don't need a voice to tell me. Time is always counting down. Every moment is one less moment. Every breath brings us closer to our last breath. The voice didn't tell us anything we didn't already know. It just forced us to pay attention. 10 days ago. No, 40. 3 days ago, the anniversary of when it all started. I stood on my roof and looked at the stars and felt connected to something larger. I feel that still, but I don't need to wait for an apocalypse to experience it. I'm learning to live like the countdown never stopped. Like every day might be my last, which means every day deserves to be lived fully, consciously, with attention paid to the small miracles of existence, the taste of good coffee, the warmth of sunlight, the sound of rain, the comfort of connection. Sometimes I wonder if that was the point all along. Not to end the world, but to wake us up to it. To remind us that we're all on the same countdown, all facing the same inevitable zero. And that may be what matters, is not how much time we have, but what we do with the time we're given. Or maybe the voice meant nothing at all, and I'm just a person trying to find meaning in randomness, pattern in chaos, purpose in the arbitrary. Either way, I'm here. We're all still here. And that has to be enough. The clock on my wall reads 9:48 now. Another minute passed. Another moment survived. Tomorrow I'll wake up and make coffee and go to work and live my ordinary life. And maybe that's the most extraordinary thing of all. That after the countdown, after zero, life simply continues. Not with answers, or revelations, or cosmic purpose, but with the same mundane beauty and terror and wonder it always had. The same uncertainty, the same brief flicker of consciousness in an uncaring universe, the same desperate human need to find meaning in the meaningless. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. And then one more breath, one more day, one more chance to decide what it all means. I choose to believe it means something. I have to. Otherwise, what was it all for? The stars are out tonight. I think I'll go back to the roof and look at them. Not because the world is ending, but because it isn't. Because I'm alive and conscious and aware of how temporary and precious that is. The countdown gave us that, if nothing else, and maybe that's more than enough. Story 4. I've been trapped in this apartment for 37 days now. Though time has become as fluid and unreliable as everything else in my life. The windows that once showed me the familiar cityscape of downtown Portland now reveal only an endless expanse of living darkness. Not the simple absence of light, but something far more unsettling, something that watches back. My name is David Chen, and I used to believe in rational explanations for everything. I was a software engineer, built my life on logic and code, on problems that had solutions and systems that followed rules. That certainty feels like a luxury from another lifetime now. It started with the blackouts, not the electrical kind. Those I could understand and fix, but something deeper, more fundamental. 3 months ago, the view from my 7th floor window began to change. Gradually at first, so subtly that I dismissed it as stress or eye strain from too many late nights debugging code. The building across the street seemed to fade slightly, as if someone was slowly turning down the contrast on a television screen. Then, The cars below moved a little less frequently, their headlights growing dimmer each evening. The streetlights flickered more often, staying dark for longer periods. I called the city about the lighting issues, filed complaints with the power company, even bought new glasses, convinced my prescription had changed. But the darkness continued its patient advance, creeping closer to my window like a tide of ink. The first time I truly understood something was wrong. I was working late on a project deadline. It was past midnight when I stretched and looked out at what should have been the familiar grid of city lights. Instead, I saw only an impenetrable wall of black pressing against the glass, so complete and dense it seemed solid enough to lean against. My logical mind immediately began cataloging explanations: fog, smoke from a distant fire, some kind of weather phenomenon I'd never encountered. But when I pressed my face to the glass and cupped my hands around my eyes, I could see my own reflection staring back from that darkness. Not reflected in the window, reflected in the darkness itself, as if it were made of some impossible black mirror. That was when I noticed the darkness moving, not swirling like fog or drifting like smoke, but pulsing with a rhythm eerily similar to breathing, or a heartbeat. I stumbled backward from the window, my coffee mug shattering on the hardwood floor. The sound seemed muffled, absorbed by the oppressive presence outside. When I looked again, the darkness had pressed closer to the glass, and I could swear I saw shapes moving within it, not quite formed enough to be called figures, but with enough suggestion of purpose to make my skin crawl. That night, I called in sick and spent the day researching everything I could find about unusual atmospheric phenomena. Aurora activity, temperature inversions, even mass hallucinations caused by gas leaks. The internet offered dozens of rational explanations, but none that explained why the darkness only seemed to exist outside my specific windows. Because that was the truly unsettling part. When I went to the building's lobby and looked outside through the main entrance, everything appeared normal. Street lights functioned. Cars passed by with their headlights, cutting through ordinary night. But when I returned to my apartment and looked out my windows, there was only that living wall of black. I began avoiding the windows during the day, keeping the blinds drawn and relying on artificial light. But the darkness seemed to seep through anyway, making my apartment feel smaller, more confined. The air grew thick and stale, despite the ventilation system working perfectly. By the second week, I couldn't leave. Not physically. The door still opened when I turned the handle. The elevator still functioned when I pressed the button. But every time I tried to step outside my apartment, something stopped me. A weight on my chest. A certainty deep in my bones that leaving would mean walking directly into that consuming darkness, becoming part of it. I ordered groceries online, had everything delivered to my door. Worked remotely, which was easy enough to arrange. Told my few friends and my concerned mother that I was fighting a persistent flu. The lies came easily, perhaps because part of me still hoped they might be true. But as the days passed, the darkness grew bolder. It began testing the windows, pressing against them with increasing force. The glass would bow inward slightly, creaking under pressure that shouldn't exist. Sometimes I could see handprints, or what looked like handprints, forming on the outside surface, though they had too many fingers, and the fingers were far too long. The darkness also began to whisper, not in any language I recognized, but in tones and cadences that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to the frightened animal brain. The sounds came from everywhere and nowhere, sometimes seeming to originate from inside the walls themselves. They spoke of depths and distances, of spaces between spaces where lost things waited in patient hunger. I tried recording these voices, but my phone only captured my own breathing and the normal sounds of a city apartment. The whispers existed only for me, apparently, which did nothing to convince me of my own sanity. Sleep became nearly impossible. When I did manage to doze, I dreamed of walking through endless corridors made of the same living darkness that surrounded my windows. In these dreams, I was searching for something or someone, but could never quite remember what. The whispers were louder there, more insistent, promising answers if I would only venture deeper into the maze of shadow. I always woke, just as I was about to discover what lay at the center of that dark labyrinth. My sheets soaked with sweat, and my heart hammering against my ribs. By the fourth week, I began to see figures in the darkness. They were tall and impossibly thin, moving with fluid grace through the black medium, outside my windows. Sometimes they paused and seemed to observe me, their presence as palpable as pressure changes before a storm. I couldn't make out faces or specific features, but I could feel their attention like ice water in my veins. The worst part was that I began to recognize them. Not their physical forms, which remained frustratingly vague, but something deeper, their essence, their individual presence. The one that appeared most frequently felt familiar, in a way that made my stomach clench with unnamed dread. It took me 3 more days to remember where I'd felt that particular psychic signature before my father. He died when I was 12, victim of a sudden heart attack that the doctors said was probably painless, probably instant. I'd mourned him properly, gone through therapy, built a successful life despite the early loss. But now, staring at this impossibly tall shadow, figure that carried the unmistakable emotional imprint of the man who'd taught me to ride a bike and helped me with algebra homework, I began to understand that grief might not be the linear process the counselors had described. The figure that felt like my father pressed closer to the window, and for a moment the darkness around it seemed less opaque. I thought I could see a face, gaunt, hollow-eyed, but unmistakably his. He mouthed words I couldn't hear through the glass, but I could read his lips. "Come outside, son. Come see what you've been missing." That's when I truly began to lose myself. I spent hours at the window now, watching the figures move through their liquid darkness, trying to identify others I might recognize. My grandmother, who died when I was in college. A childhood friend lost in a motorcycle accident. Even Mrs. Patterson, the elderly neighbor who'd passed away peacefully in her sleep just 2 months before this all began. They all looked wrong, stretched and twisted, as if the darkness had taken their essential selves and reformed them according to alien aesthetic principles. But their emotional signatures remained intact, calling to parts of me I'd thought were safely buried. The whispers became more insistent, more comprehensible. They spoke of reunion, of spaces beyond the thin membrane of reality, where the living and the dead could exist together in perfect understanding. They described the apartment as a cocoon, a transitional space where I was being prepared for something greater. You've been chosen, they murmured in voices like wind through empty buildings. You've been marked for translation. The boundary grows thin here, in this place between worlds. You have only to step through. Part of me, a growing part, wanted to believe them. The isolation was becoming unbearable. My carefully ordered life had become a prison of stale air and recycled thoughts. The darkness outside promised connection, purpose, answers to questions I'd been afraid to ask. What if death wasn't an ending, but a transformation? What if the people I'd lost were still accessible, waiting just beyond the thin barrier of ordinary perception? I began to test the windows, pressing my palms against the glass and feeling for weak points. The darkness responded to my touch, surging forward with what almost seemed like eagerness. The whispers grew excited, congratulatory, as if I were finally understanding an important lesson. But something held me back. Some stubborn core of rationality that refused to accept the easy explanations the darkness offered. Because if I was honest with myself, the figures outside didn't feel entirely like my lost loved ones. They felt like something else, wearing their emotional fingerprints. Like actors who'd studied their roles well, but couldn't quite suppress their true nature. And their true nature felt hungry. Last night, I conducted an experiment. I turned off every light in the apartment and sat in complete darkness for an hour, trying to understand if the boundary between inside and outside was breaking down. What I discovered chilled me more than anything I'd experienced so far. In the absolute dark of my apartment, I could sense the figures more clearly. They weren't confined to the space outside my windows. They were everywhere, pressing in from all sides, held back by something I couldn't identify. The walls of my apartment weren't just physical barriers. They were part of some larger containment system, a bubble of normal reality, floating in an ocean of something altogether different. And that bubble was shrinking. I could feel it contracting slowly but inexorably, the safe space growing smaller each day. The whispers confirmed my fears, speaking gleefully of the final convergence, when the last barriers would dissolve and everything would become part of the greater darkness. Soon, they promised. Very soon now. The translation is almost complete. I'm writing this as the sun sets on what I fear may be my last day in the world. I've always known. The darkness outside has grown so dense that it blocks all natural light, making day and night indistinguishable. The temperature in my apartment has dropped noticeably, and my breath fogs when I speak aloud, which I've been doing more frequently, just to hear a human voice, even my own. The figures have multiplied. Where once I saw only a handful of familiar shadows, now I can sense dozens, perhaps hundreds, all pressing against the weakening barriers that separate their realm from mine. They've grown bolder, more insistent, their whispers becoming a constant susurrus of invitation and threat. But I think I finally understand what's really happening here. This isn't about death, or the afterlife, or supernatural predation. This is about the fundamental nature of loneliness itself. The darkness isn't something external that invaded my life. It's something I've been carrying inside me for years, maybe decades, feeding it with isolation and disconnection until it grew large enough to manifest in the physical world. Every person I've lost, every relationship I've failed to maintain, every time I chose solitude over connection, all of it has contributed to this hungry emptiness that now surrounds me. The figures aren't my loved ones returned from death. They're projections of my own need, my desperate desire for connection, twisted into something that offers communion at the price of everything I am. The question that remains is whether this understanding comes too late. The window glass is beginning to crack now, hairline fractures spreading like a spider web across the surface. The pressure outside has become enormous, the darkness pressing against my sanctuary with the weight of ocean depths. I can feel my resolve weakening with each whispered promise, each familiar face that appears in the swirling black. Part of me wonders what would be so wrong with surrender. To step through that failing barrier and join the eternal crowd of the isolated and forgotten, to become part of something larger than my small, frightened self. The darkness promises understanding, communion, an end to the terrible weight of individual consciousness. But another part, smaller but still present, remembers what it felt like to genuinely connect with another person. The warmth of my mother's hand, the laughter shared with friends, even the simple pleasure of a smile from a stranger on the street. Those memories feel like candle flames in a vast cavern, tiny but stubbornly persistent. The glass cracks further. Soon, there will be nothing left to hold back the tide. I don't know if anyone will ever read this, or if there will be enough left of our world to support readers when the darkness finishes its work. But if you do find these words, remember this: the greatest horror isn't monsters or death or supernatural malevolence. The greatest horror is the slow dissolution of human connection, the incremental surrender to the isolation that waits patient as gravity in the spaces between us all. Don't let the darkness grow too large to contain. Don't feed it with your loneliness until it becomes strong enough to. The writing becomes increasingly erratic before ending in a series of illegible marks, as if the pen was dragged across the page by an unsteady hand. Story 5. My name is Marcus Reed, and I am quite possibly the last human being on Earth who still has hope. It's been 14 months since the convergence. That's what we survivors call the day when everything changed. When the sky filled with objects that defied every law of physics we thought we understood. When humanity's reign on this planet ended not with warfare or natural disaster, but with a gentle, inexorable transformation that left most of our species in a state we can only describe as elsewhere. I write this from a maintenance bunker 60 feet beneath the ruins of Chicago, surrounded by the soft hum of generators that have somehow continued functioning despite the fact that the power grid collapsed months ago. The air tastes of recycled breath and desperation, but it's still air that human lungs can process, which makes this place precious beyond measure. Above me, the world has become something beautiful and terrible that I lack the words to properly describe. The alien structures, and I use that term reluctantly because alien implies something foreign. When these constructions seem to grow from the earth as naturally as trees, rise from every major city like crystalline forests of impossible geometry. They sing sometimes, these towers, harmonizing in frequencies that make your bones ache with longing for places you've never been. The sky hasn't been blue since the convergence. Instead, it shifts through spectrums of color that shouldn't exist, painting the landscape in hues that bypass the eyes entirely and register directly in the nervous system as emotions. Grief, purple; hope, silver; love, gold. Looking up for too long induces a kind of synesthetic rapture that most survivors learn to avoid after losing friends to what we call dreaming. A condition where people become so entranced by the alien aurora that they forget to eat, drink, or move until their bodies simply shut down. But it's not the architectural impossibilities or the psychedelic atmosphere that truly defines our new reality. It's the absence. 7 billion people lived on this planet when the convergence began. Within 6 hours, that number had been reduced to perhaps a few thousand scattered individuals hiding in deep bunkers, abandoned subway tunnels, and forgotten caves. The aliens, if that's what they are, didn't kill us. They didn't enslave us. They did something far more unsettling. They took us somewhere else. The process was hauntingly peaceful. I watched it happen to my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, from my apartment window as those first crystalline growths began to emerge from the sidewalks. She was watering her garden, as she did every morning when one of the structures simply embraced her. There's no other word for it. The crystal flowed around her like liquid glass, and for a moment I could see her inside, her face expressing not fear, but wonder, as if she was seeing something magnificent that I couldn't perceive. Then the crystal became opaque, and she was gone, not dead. The bio-scanners I've jury rig detect no decomposition. no cellular breakdown within the crystalline matrices that now dot the landscape like translucent monuments. The people are still there, somehow, preserved in a state that exists somewhere between sleep and transcendence. I've counted over 300 such formations just in my immediate neighborhood. Each one contains a human figure, perfectly preserved, facing in random directions, as if they'd simply been walking about their daily business when time stopped for them. Children frozen mid-laugh, commuters caught between steps, couples embracing in crystal wombs that pulse with soft, internal light. The true horror isn't that they're dead. It's that they might be happier than we are. Because the dreams started almost immediately for those of us who remained unclaimed. Every night, when I close my eyes, I see what I can only describe as paradise. Vast libraries containing all the knowledge that ever was or could be. Gardens where every flower sings in perfect harmony. Cities of light where pain and loneliness are extinct concepts. And in these dreams, I'm always searching for someone. A presence that feels familiar, yet impossible to identify. As if I'm trying to remember the face of a friend I haven't met yet. I wake from these visions feeling homesick for a place that doesn't exist. Or perhaps for a place that exists only for those who've been claimed by the crystal embrace. The other survivors report identical experiences, and we've begun to suspect that these aren't dreams at all, but glimpses of where the taken ones have gone. This is what makes hope so dangerous for those of us who remain. Sarah Martinez lasted 8 months before she walked into one of the formations voluntarily. She left a note saying she couldn't bear another night of dreaming about paradise while waking up to canned food and recycled air. Thomas Kim followed her 3 weeks later, then Jennifer Walsh, then David Parr. Of the 47 survivors I'd made contact within the first months after the convergence, only 12 remain, and each week, another one of us decides that the dreams are preferable to reality. I understand the temptation. The world above is empty but not lifeless. Plants grow in impossible abundance now, and the animals that remain seem healthier, more vibrant, as if the planet itself is healing from some long illness. But it's a garden without gardeners, a symphony without an audience, a masterpiece with no one left to appreciate its beauty. The loneliness is crushing. Not just the absence of human company, though that weighs heavily, but the sense that we are witnesses to something magnificent that we're not allowed to participate in. We are the uninvited, the left behind, watching through windows at a party, will never be allowed to join. But I continue to resist, and I continue to document what I see, because I believe there's a reason some of us were left unclaimed. We weren't forgotten or overlooked. We were chosen for a different purpose. 6 months ago, I discovered something that changed my understanding of our situation entirely. I was scavenging for supplies in the ruins of the Museum of Science and Industry when I found Dr. Elena Vasquez, the theoretical physicist who'd been working on quantum consciousness studies before the convergence. She wasn't claimed like the others. She was hiding in her laboratory, surrounded by equipment that was still somehow functional despite the electromagnetic chaos that had disabled most technology. "You have to understand," she told me, her eyes bright with the fever of someone who'd been living on caffeine pills and obsession for months. "This isn't an invasion. It's an invitation." She showed me her research. Data collected from sensors she'd managed to keep operational throughout the convergence. The readings were unlike anything in our scientific literature. Quantum signatures suggesting that reality itself was being gently restructured, not destroyed but translated. "The entities aren't from another planet," she explained, her hands shaking as she pulled up wave pattern analyses on her surviving computer. "They're from another dimension of existence entirely. Think of it as a higher state of being, not physically different, but experientially richer. They're offering humanity an evolutionary leap." "Then why weren't all of us taken?" I asked. Her smile was infinitely sad. "Because someone needs to bear witness. Someone needs to remember what came before and document what comes after. We're not the leftovers, Marcus. We're the chroniclers, the keepers of the story." That was the last time I saw Dr. Vasquez. A week later, I found her laboratory empty except for her notes and a new crystal formation that pulsed with the same rhythm as her excited heartbeat when she'd shared her discoveries. But her research gave me purpose beyond mere survival. If we are indeed the chroniclers of humanity's transformation, then our duty is to understand what's happening and preserve that understanding. For whom? Future archaeologists from other worlds. The transformed humans themselves, should they ever choose to return. I don't know. But the act of documentation has become my anchor in a world that no longer makes sense according to old rules. Over the past 8 months, I've made contact with survivor communities around the globe using patched together radio equipment. The stories are remarkably consistent: peaceful assimilation, dream visions of paradise, gradual voluntary surrender to the crystal embrace. But also small groups of witnesses like myself, people who seem to have been deliberately preserved to observe and record. We've begun sharing our findings, creating a distributed archive of humanity's transformation. Dukkar. Raj Patel in New Delhi has documented the healing effect of the alien presence on the local ecosystem. Radiation levels around Chernobyl have dropped to safe levels. The Amazon rainforest is regenerating at impossible speeds, and the oceans are clearing of pollution at a rate that defies explanation. Maria Santos in Sao Paulo has recorded the behavioral changes in animal populations, increased cooperation between species, enhanced intelligence in everything from crows to dolphins, as if the consciousness expanding effects of the alien presence extend to all life forms, not just humans. And here in North America, I've focused on the psychological and social aspects of the transformation, interviewing the few remaining survivors and analyzing the patterns of voluntary assimilation. What we've discovered is that the transformation isn't random. Those who were taken first were generally people experiencing high levels of stress, depression, or existential dissatisfaction. The dreams of paradise seemed to offer them release from suffering they couldn't otherwise escape. But those of us who remain were the ones who were already finding meaning in the struggle itself. Artists, researchers, caregivers, people whose sense of purpose comes from the process of creation and discovery rather than from the achievement of perfect happiness. It's as if the entities understand that transformation without witnesses is meaningless, that growth requires both participants and observers, that even paradise needs documentarians. This realization has given me something I didn't expect peace. Yesterday, I received a radio transmission from the last survivor in Tokyo, a poet named Akiko Tanaka. Her voice was calm as she told me she'd made her decision, that the dreams had become too vivid to resist any longer. But before she signed off permanently, she said something that will stay with me. Marcus, San, I believe we were chosen not as punishment, but as gift. We get to see both worlds, the one that was and the one that is becoming. We are the bridge between states of being. Tonight, as I write this, I can hear something new in the alien song that drifts down from the crystalline towers above. It sounds almost like gratitude, as if our witnessing, our documentation, our stubborn refusal to surrender to paradise has been valuable to them in ways we couldn't understand. 3 days ago, something unprecedented happened. One of the crystal formations opened, and the person inside stepped out. It was my former colleague, Dr. James Wright, who'd been claimed in the second wave of the convergence. But he was different. Not physically. He looked exactly as he had 14 months ago. But there was something in his eyes, a depth of understanding that hadn't been there before. "Marcus," he said, his voice carrying harmonics that reminded me of the alien song. "I need you to know that we're not gone. We're just more." He could only stay for a few minutes. Existing in our dimensional space seemed to require tremendous effort. But he shared what he could of the experience. Imagine, everything you've ever known about consciousness was just the surface of an infinite ocean. He explained. The transformation doesn't take you away from yourself. It reveals who you really were all along. The loneliness, the separation, the feeling that you're isolated inside your own head, all illusions. We are connected to everything that ever was or will be. Then why was I left behind? I asked. His smile was radiant. Because someone needs to help the others find their way home when they're ready. The transformation isn't complete until everyone who wants to transcend has the opportunity. Your documentation, your research, your very existence as a witness. It's creating a bridge for those who aren't ready yet. He gestured toward my recording equipment. My scattered notes, the radio that connected me to the handful of other chroniclers around the world. You're building a map, Marcus. A guide for consciousness to follow from one state of being to another. Every word you write, every observation you make, every moment you choose hope over despair, it strengthens the path for others. Before he faded back into his crystalline sanctuary, he told me that I would know when my work was finished, when the bridge was complete. Until then, he said, my purpose was to continue bearing witness, continue hoping, continue believing that consciousness, in all its forms, was worth preserving and celebrating. That was 3 days ago, and since then, I've felt something I hadn't experienced since before the convergence. Genuine excitement about the future. Because I finally understand what we're doing here, why some of us were chosen to remain, why the loneliness and the dreams and the slow loss of companions has been necessary. We are not the leftovers of a conquered species. We are the midwives of a new form of existence, helping to birth something unprecedented in the universe. A transformation of consciousness that preserves free will, that honors the importance of choice, that recognizes that paradise means nothing without the option to refuse it. The aliens. Though I'm beginning to think of them more as evolved aspects of consciousness itself, could have simply transformed all of humanity at once. But instead they chose a slower path, one that allows each individual to come to the decision in their own time, with full understanding of what they're choosing. And they needed witnesses to make that possible. They needed people like me to document the process, to serve as living proof that choice exists, to create the narrative bridge that allows consciousness to transform while maintaining continuity of identity. I am no longer the last human with hope. I am the first human with a new kind of hope. Hope that transcendence and free will can coexist, that evolution can occur without erasure, that paradise is only meaningful when it's chosen rather than imposed. Tomorrow, I'm going to make contact with the 3 remaining chroniclers. Dr. Patel in Delhi, Professor Kowalski in Krakow, and the musician known only as Echo Broadcasting from somewhere in Australia. Together, we're going to compile everything we've learned into a final archive. A complete record of humanity's transformation for whoever might need it in the future. And then I think I'll be ready to make my own choice. Not because I'm giving up, but because I finally understand that choosing transformation isn't surrender. It's graduation. The dreams of paradise aren't temptations. They're previews of what we're becoming, offered freely to help us make an informed decision about our own existence. And the alien presence isn't taking us away from humanity. It's showing us what humanity could become if we're brave enough to evolve. I've been afraid accepting the transformation would mean losing myself. But James showed me otherwise. The self isn't destroyed in the process. It's revealed, expanded, connected to the infinite web of consciousness that underlies all existence. Tomorrow, after I finish our final archive, I think I'll walk up to the surface and look at one of the crystal formations with new eyes. Not as a prison or a trap, but as a chrysalis. A doorway to whatever comes next for conscious beings who are ready to stop being afraid of their own potential. The last signal I'll send won't be a cry for help or a final goodbye. It will be a message of gratitude for the experience of witnessing something impossible, for the honor of serving as a bridge between worlds, for the gift of choosing hope in the face of the unknown. Transmission ends, signal lost. Archive complete, bridge constructed, choice preserved. Story 6. I first saw him 3 weeks after the accident. Not saw him exactly. Sensed him. Felt the weight of eyes on the back of my neck as I walked home from the grocery store. I turned around twice, scanning the evening street, but there was no one there. Just parked cars and darkening sky and the distant sound of traffic. But I felt him. I knew someone was watching. The accident wasn't my fault. That's what everyone said. The lawyers, the police, the grief counselor my sister insisted I see. Not your fault, they repeated. Like a mantra that might become true if spoken enough times. The other driver had run the red light. The other driver had been speeding. The other driver had been texting. The other driver had died on impact. His passenger, his 16-year-old daughter, had died 3 days later in the hospital. I'd walked away with a concussion and some bruised ribs. Not my fault, everyone said, but they weren't in my car that night. They didn't see the light turn yellow. They didn't know that I'd accelerated just a little, eager to make it through, not wanting to wait through another cycle. Not my fault. But not entirely innocent either. I'd been having trouble sleeping. That was normal, the counselor said. A trauma does that. The nightmares would fade. The guilt would ease. I just needed time. But it wasn't nightmares keeping me awake. It was the feeling that someone was in my apartment, standing in the hallway, watching from the corner, waiting in the next room. I'd get up and check. Every time. Walking through every room, turning on every light, looking in every closet. Nothing. No one. Just my own reflection in dark windows and the sound of my own breathing. Then I'd go back to bed and feel him there again. Watching. Always watching. The second time I saw him, really saw him, was at the supermarket. I was in the cereal aisle, trying to remember if I preferred the blue box or the red box. My mind fuzzy from lack of sleep. And I felt it again. That pressure of a gaze. That certainty that someone was staring. I looked up and there he was at the end of the aisle. A man. Average height. Average build. Wearing dark clothes, jeans and a jacket despite the warm weather. But his face. I couldn't focus on his face. It was like trying to look at something underwater, distorted and unclear. I could see he had a face, that there were features there, but I couldn't make sense of them. Couldn't hold them in my mind. He didn't move. Just stood there, that blurred face pointed in my direction, watching. My cereal box fell from my hands, clattering against the tile floor. I blinked, and he was gone. The aisle was empty, except for an elderly woman comparing granola brands. Completely oblivious to my sudden panic, I abandoned my cart and left. Walked home quickly, checking behind me constantly, but I didn't see him again. Not then, but I felt him, following me. Staying just out of sight, a shadow at the edge of my vision, a presence in the space behind me. I tried to tell my sister about it. She listened patiently, her face carefully neutral. Then suggested maybe I should talk to the counselor about increasing my medication. I tried to tell my best friend, who gently reminded me that trauma can make us paranoid, hypervigilant, seeing threats where none exist. Maybe they were right. Maybe it was all in my head. But if it was all in my head, why did I keep seeing him? Why did strangers sometimes pause and glance behind me, frowning, as if they'd glimpsed something there, then shake their heads and move on? Why did my neighbor's dog bark at empty air beside me, hackles raised, backing away with a low whine of fear? I started changing my routine, taking different routes home, shopping at different stores, but it didn't matter. Wherever I went, I'd eventually feel it. That weight of observation, that certainty of being followed, and sometimes, if I turned quickly enough, I'd catch a glimpse of him, standing on the street corner, sitting on a bus bench, leaning against a building, always that blurred face, always watching, always utterly still. I stopped going out except when necessary, started having groceries delivered, worked from home, emailing my boss that I had a medical situation that required isolation. He was understanding. Too understanding. I could read the concern in his carefully worded replies. The implication that I should take all the time I needed, maybe talk to someone, maybe consider a longer leave of absence. But staying home didn't help, because he was here too, in my apartment, getting closer. At first, he stayed in the hallway outside my bedroom. I'd wake in the night and feel him there, just beyond my door, standing in the darkness, watching my door, waiting. Then he was in my living room. I'd be watching television, trying to lose myself in mindless shows, and I'd feel him appear behind the couch. I'd keep my eyes fixed on the screen, my neck prickling, my breath shallow, knowing that if I turned around I'd see him. That blurred, faceless shape standing there, watching. I stopped turning around, stopped trying to catch him. It was better not to look. Better to pretend I didn't know. Because something told me that if I acknowledged him, if I looked directly at him and let him know that I knew he was there, something would change. Some unspoken rule would be broken. So I pretended. I went about my life as if I were alone. As if I couldn't feel him in every room I entered. As if I didn't sense him standing behind me when I brushed my teeth. As if he weren't sitting in the corner while I ate my silent, solitary meals. But it was getting harder. He was getting closer. Each day, each hour, the distance between us shrank. I could feel the cold that radiated from him now. Could smell something like ozone and rust. Could hear the faintest sound of breathing that wasn't mine. Last night, I woke to find him standing beside my bed. Right there, an arm's length away. I could see his shape in the darkness. That blurred place where a face should be turned toward mine. I closed my eyes immediately and pretended to be asleep. my heart hammering so hard I was certain he could hear it. He stood there for what felt like hours. I kept my breathing slow and steady, even though every instinct screamed at me to run. To open my eyes, to look at him and demand to know what he wanted. But I didn't. I lay there with my eyes squeezed shut and pretended. Finally, as dawn light began to seep through my curtains, I felt him move away, felt the cold recede, felt the weight of his presence shift to another part of the apartment. But he didn't leave. He never leaves anymore. I'm writing this now, in the afternoon, sitting at my kitchen table. I can feel him standing in the doorway behind me. I haven't turned around to confirm it. I don't need to. I know he's there. He's always there now. The grief counselor called earlier. Left a message asking me to schedule a follow-up appointment. She sounded concerned. I should call her back. I should tell someone what's happening. But what would I say? That I'm being haunted by something with no face. That the man I killed, because that's what it was, wasn't it? I killed him and his daughter, accident or not, that he sent something to watch me, to follow me, to slowly, inexorably close the distance between us. They'd say it was grief, guilt, trauma manifesting as delusion. They'd increase my medication, maybe hospitalize me, and he'd be there too, following me down white corridors, standing beside my hospital bed, watching, always watching. I've started remembering more about that night. Details I'd pushed away, details my mind had mercifully blurred, like how I'd been tired, how I'd considered pulling over, getting coffee, but decided to just push through and get home. Like how the light had been yellow for longer than I admitted. Like how I'd seen the other car just for a split second before impact, and known that this was going to happen, known that I should brake. But my foot had frozen on the accelerator. Not my fault, everyone said. But they didn't know. They didn't know about that frozen moment, that instant of recognition, that choice I made or failed to make. He knows, the one who follows, he knows. I wonder sometimes what he wants, if he wants anything. Maybe he's not the dead man at all. Maybe he's something I created myself. A manifestation of guilt so profound that it took shape and substance. A punishment I conjured from my own mind. A witness to ensure I never forget, never forgive myself, never escape what I've done. Or maybe he's exactly what he appears to be, something sent by the dead, a collector, a reminder, a promise of what's coming. Because he's not just watching anymore, he's waiting. I can feel the patience in him, vast and terrible, the certainty. He knows something I don't. Knows how this ends. Knows that eventually, inevitably, the distance between us will close completely. And then what? What happens when there's no space left between us? When I can no longer pretend not to see him? When I finally turn around and look directly at that blurred, faceless shape and acknowledge what I've been running from. I'm afraid to find out, but I'm also tired, so tired, tired of pretending, tired of looking away, tired of carrying this weight of guilt and fear and knowing. maybe it would be a relief. To finally face him. To finally let whatever is going to happen, happen. The sun is setting now. I can see the light changing through the window, golden hour bleeding into blue twilight. My favorite time of day, once. Now it just means the darkness is coming. And in the darkness, he's even clearer, even more real. I can feel him moving closer. Just a step, just a tiny shift in the air. The cold is spreading through the kitchen. The smell of ozone growing stronger. That breathing, soft and steady, just behind my chair. I should be terrified. I am terrified. But there's something else too. Something like resignation, like acceptance. Like a prisoner who's been running for so long that the idea of stopping, of finally being caught, brings its own strange peace. My hand is shaking as I write this. The pen keeps skipping on the paper. Behind me I can hear something else now. Not just breathing. A sound like fabric moving, like arms lifting, like hands reaching forward. He's right behind me now, right behind my chair. I can feel the cold radiating from him, can smell that rust, and ozone scent so strong it makes my eyes water. Can hear that breathing, slow and steady, right behind my head. I'm going to turn around. I've decided. I'm going to stop pretending. Stop running. Stop looking away. I'm going to turn around and face whatever is there. Face what I've done. Face what I deserve. My sister might find this note. Or maybe the landlord when the rent goes unpaid. They'll think I lost my mind, succumbed to guilt and trauma. They'll be sad but not surprised. The grief counselor will blame herself. My best friend will cry and wonder if she should have pushed harder, done more. But it's not their fault, it's mine. All of it. The accident, the deaths, this thing that follows, this thing that watches, this thing that waits behind me now, patient as stone, cold as deep water. I can feel his hands near my shoulders, not touching, not yet, but so close. So close I can feel the cold of them like frost on my skin. In a moment they'll touch me, they'll make contact, and then I'll know. Then everything will be clear. I'm turning now. I'm going to look. I'm going to see that blurred face clearly for the first time. I'm going to see what guilt looks like when it takes shape. What death looks like when it comes collecting. I'm turning. I'm looking. The face. Oh God, the face. It's not blurred. It was never blurred. I just couldn't bear to see it clearly. Couldn't let myself recognize it. Because it's not the man from the accident. It's not some vengeful ghost or manifestation of guilt. It's me. It's my own face. But wrong. Subtly, terribly wrong. The eyes too wide, the mouth too slack, the skin too pale. It's me as I would have been if I'd been the one who died that night. If the car had hit differently. If luck had shifted just slightly. If justice had been served. It's the version of me that should have died. The version that knows, with absolute certainty, that I'm the one who got away. Who survived. Who walks around in a life that should have ended. And now it's reaching for me. Now it's smiling with my mouth. Now it's whispering with my voice, so soft I can barely hear it. It's time to stop running. Time to give back what you took. Time to make things right. The hands are on my shoulders now, ice cold, pulling me backward, pulling me out of this chair, out of this life, out of this borrowed time I've been living on. I'm not fighting. I'm not screaming. I'm just letting it happen. Because maybe this is how it was always supposed to end. Maybe the accident didn't miss me at all. Maybe I've been dead all along, and this has been nothing but a dream, a guilt-induced fantasy. A last few moments of consciousness stretching into weeks and months, while my body dies in a hospital bed somewhere. Machines beeping their steady rhythm, family holding my hand and whispering goodbye. Or maybe this is something else. Something older. The universe correcting an imbalance. Death collecting what it's owed. The cosmic scales balancing themselves at last. I can't move my arms now. Can't feel my legs. Everything is cold. Everything is numb. The apartment is fading, growing dark, growing distant. I can see it like I'm looking through water, through glass, through dimensions I don't understand. The thing wearing my face is pulling me somewhere. Somewhere without light. Somewhere without sound. Somewhere where all the people who should have died but didn't end up eventually. A place of debts paid. Of accounts settled. Of stories ending the way they were always meant to. I'm not afraid anymore. I'm just tired. So tired. And maybe, finally, I'll be able to sleep. Really sleep. Without guilt. Without fear. Without the weight of survival pressing down on me like water. Like earth. Like the knowledge that I'm living someone else's life. The darkness is complete now. The cold is absolute. I can't see the apartment anymore. Can't see anything. Just the thing with my face, pulling me deeper into nothing. And as the last of me dissolves into shadow, I realize something. The one who follows wasn't hunting me. Wasn't tormenting me. Wasn't even punishing me. It was trying to save me. To free me from this life of guilt and fear. To take me home to the place where I should have been all along. I should be grateful. I think I am grateful. But it's hard to tell. Hard to feel anything now. Hard to think. Hard to remember who I was or why any of it mattered. There's just the cold. The dark. The sense of falling or rising. It's impossible to tell which. And somewhere, very far away, the sound of someone crying. My sister, maybe. Or my mother. Or the daughter who died 3 days after the accident, calling from whatever place the dead go, welcoming me finally to join her. I'm sorry, I want to say. I'm sorry I took so long. I'm sorry I ran. I'm sorry I pretended. I'm sorry I didn't die when I was supposed to. But I don't have a voice anymore. Don't have words. Don't have anything but this dissolving sense of self, scattering like ashes, like dust, like morning mist burning away in sunlight. The one who follows has caught me at last. The one who follows was me all along. And now there's no more running. No more pretending. No more looking away. Just the end. Finally. Mercifully the end. Story 7. The spare room had been empty for 2 years before I decided to rent it out. After the divorce, the house felt too large. too full of echoes and spaces that nobody used. The bills were mounting, and the silence was worse than any financial pressure. I told myself I was looking for a tenant for practical reasons. But the truth was simpler. Couldn't stand being alone in that house anymore. I posted the listing on a Thursday evening. Quiet room in safe neighborhood, utilities included, access to kitchen and common areas, references required. Nothing special. Nothing that would stand out from the dozens of other postings in the area. I expected a trickle of responses, mostly students or young professionals looking for something cheap while they saved for their own places. By Friday morning, I had 43 messages. By that evening, the number had climbed to over 100. Most were the usual inquiries, asking about parking, pets, the terms of the lease. But one stood out. It came from someone named E. Morrison, and it was brief to the point of being cryptic. I am a quiet person with no complications. I can pay 6 months in advance. When may I view the room? 6 months in advance. That alone was enough to move Morrison to the top of my list. I scheduled a viewing for Saturday afternoon. He arrived exactly on time, which I appreciated. Punctuality suggested reliability, and reliability was what I needed most. I answered the door to find a man of indeterminate age. He could have been 30 or 50. His features somehow ageless and forgettable. Medium height, medium build, wearing a gray suit that looked expensive but understated. His face was pleasant but blank, like a default character in a video game before you customize the features. Mr. Morrison. I extended my hand. He took it. His grip was firm but cool, his palm smooth and dry. M's Chen. Thank you for seeing me. His voice was equally unremarkable. Not deep, not high, no accent or particular inflection. The kind of voice that would disappear in a crowd, that you'd forget the moment you stopped hearing it. I showed him the room. It was small but clean, with a window that looked out over the backyard, a decent closet, and enough space for a bed and a desk. He walked around it slowly, running his hand along the walls, examining the window latch, opening and closing the closet door. He didn't say anything, just nodded occasionally as if checking items off an invisible list. The bathroom is shared, I said, filling the silence. Kitchen too, obviously. I work from home most days, but I'm quiet. I won't bother you. And I won't bother you, he replied, still looking around the room. I'm a very private person, Miss Chen. I keep to myself. You'll barely know I'm here. Something about the way he said, it sent a small chill through me, though I couldn't have explained why. Maybe it was the flatness of his tone, or the way his eyes, gray, I noticed, the same shade as his suit, never quite seemed to focus on anything directly. Do you have references? I asked. Employment verification. He reached into his jacket and produced an envelope. Inside were letters from 2 previous landlords, both glowing in their praise. He was clean, quiet, paid on time, never caused any problems. There was also a bank statement showing significantly more than 6 months' rent in his account. "What do you do for work?" I asked, scanning the documents. "Consultation," he said vaguely. "I work remotely. You'll never hear me. I promise." I should have asked more questions. What kind of consultation? What company? Could I speak to his current employer? But the money was there, in black and white, and the references were impeccable, and I was so tired of being alone in that big empty house. "When would you like to move in?" He smiled then, a small expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. Would tomorrow be acceptable? He moved in the next day with a single suitcase and a laptop bag. No furniture, no boxes of books or personal items, no pictures to hang or knacks to place. Just those 2 bags and himself. I helped him carry them up, or tried to. He politely declined, saying he traveled light and preferred to settle in on his own. "I'll be very quiet," he said again, standing in the doorway of his new room. "You won't even notice me." He was right. For the first week, I barely saw him. I'd hear his door open occasionally, the soft sound of footsteps in the hallway, the bathroom door closing. But he moved like a ghost. His presence suggested more than observed. He never seemed to be in the kitchen when I was there. I never heard music or television from his room. When I passed by his door, there was only silence. On the 8th day, I realized something odd. I'd never seen him eat. I know that sounds strange. Something easily explained. Maybe he ate when I was asleep, or out, or in my office with the door closed. But I'm a light sleeper. And I work from home, and my office is right next to the kitchen. I would have heard the refrigerator opening, the microwave running, the water running for dishes. I would have smelled food cooking. There was nothing. I started paying more attention. I'd position myself where I could see the kitchen, or I'd leave my office door cracked open. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and creep downstairs, telling myself I was just getting water, but really checking to see if Morrison was there, finally eating something. He never was. The refrigerator contents remained exactly as I'd left them. The dishes I'd washed stayed in the same positions in the cabinet. Even the garbage seemed to contain only my trash, my coffee grounds and food wrappers and vegetable peelings. After 2 weeks, I knocked on his door. I'd prepared an excuse, some question about utilities or mail, but I needed to see him, to confirm he was real and normal, and not just some figment of my increasingly anxious imagination. He opened the door immediately, as if he'd been standing right behind it. He looked exactly the same as the day he moved in the gray suit, pleasant blank face, those eyes that seemed to look through rather than at things. M's Chen. Is something wrong? No, I realized I never gave you the Wi-Fi password. A lie. I'd written it down for him on his first day. Oh, that's kind of you, but I have my own hotspot. He smiled that small smile again. Was there anything else? I looked past him into the room. It was empty, not just neat or minimalist, completely empty. The bed was made so perfectly it looked unused. The desk had his laptop on it, closed, a thin layer of dust visible even from the doorway. There were no clothes visible, no shoes on the floor, no books or papers or any indication that someone actually lived in that space. "Do you need anything?" I asked, unable to stop myself. "Furniture, dishes." "I have everything I need," he said. I prefer simplicity. I wanted to ask more, to push past him and examine the room properly. To demand to know why it looked like a hotel room that had never been occupied. But his expression remained pleasant and blank, waiting patiently for me to leave, and I found myself backing away instead. "All right. Well, let me know if you need anything." "I will. Thank you, Miss Chen." The door closed with a soft click, and I stood in the hallway for a long moment, my heart beating faster than it should have been. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the house, waiting for sounds of movement from Morrison's room. There was nothing. No shifting weight on floorboards, no rustle of sheets, no breathing or snoring or any sign that a living person occupied the space 20 feet from my bedroom. At 3 a.m, I got up and crept into the hallway. A line of light showed beneath Morrison's door. Was he awake, working on his laptop? I pressed my ear against the door and listened. Silence. Complete, absolute silence. Not the silence of someone being quiet, but the silence of an empty room. The silence of absence. I reached for the doorknob, my hand trembling. It would be easy to turn it, to look inside, to confirm what I was beginning to suspect. That there was no one in there at all. That Morrison was somehow not real. That I'd rented my spare room to a ghost, or a figment, or something that only pretended to be human. But I couldn't make myself do it. Some deep instinct warned me that opening, that door uninvited, would be a mistake, would break some unspoken rule that kept me safe. So I went back to bed and lay awake until dawn, watching shadows move across my ceiling. The next morning, I called the references he'd provided. The first number went to a disconnected line. The second rang and rang. No voicemail. No answer. The bank statement looked legitimate, but when I squinted at the fine print, I couldn't quite make out the name of the bank. The letters seemed to shift and blur, as if they'd been printed with ink that couldn't quite decide what words it wanted to form. I should have been more frightened. I should have confronted Morrison, demanded answers, told him to leave. But the truth was, I wasn't afraid. Not exactly. It was more like unease, a persistent sense that something was wrong, but not necessarily dangerous. Like living with a puzzle I couldn't solve, but that hadn't hurt me yet. And he was the perfect tenant in every measurable way. The rent appeared in my account exactly when it should. No noise, no mess, no complaints from neighbors. He used no utilities as far as I could tell. My bills actually went down after he moved in. When I saw him, which was rarely, he was always polite, always courteous, always that same pleasant blank presence that asked nothing of me. Weeks became months. I developed a routine around Morrison's invisible schedule. I'd leave food in the kitchen sometimes, testing whether he'd take it. It always stayed where I'd left it. I'd listen for him at night, straining to hear any sound of human presence. There was never anything. Once, I tried staying up all night, sitting in the dark living room, where I could see both the stairs and the front door, waiting to see if Morrison would leave, would go to a store or a restaurant, would do anything that normal people do. But he never appeared. The only movement was the shadows lengthening and shrinking as the moon moved across the sky. I began to wonder if he was really in his room at all. Maybe he'd left weeks ago, silently, without telling me. And the rent that kept appearing was some kind of automated payment that would continue until the bank account ran dry. Maybe the reason I never saw him eat or heard him sleep was because there was no one there to eat or sleep. But then I'd catch glimpses of him, just brief moments. A figure at the top of the stairs, gone when I looked directly. A shadow passing by a window. The sense of someone standing just out of sight, just beyond the edge of my peripheral vision. And occasionally, very occasionally, I'd see him fool, Onzai standing in the hallway, sitting in the rarely used living room, always in that gray suit, always with that pleasant empty expression. Good morning, Miss Chen. Good evening, Ms. Chen. Lovely weather, Miss Chen. Pleasantries that required no response, that faded into the air like smoke. 4 months after he moved in, I had a friend over for dinner. Sarah, who'd known me since college, who'd helped me through the divorce, who'd been encouraging me to get out more, to stop isolating myself. So you have a tenant now, she said as I poured wine. That must be nice, not being alone in this big house. It's fine, I said. He's very quiet. What's he like? I opened my mouth to describe Morrison and realized I couldn't. What was he like? What color were his eyes exactly? How tall was he? What was his voice like? The details slipped away every time I tried to grasp them. He's unremarkable, I finally said. Very unremarkable. Well, I'd like to meet him if he's around. I don't think. I started to say, but then Morrison was there, standing in the kitchen doorway. I hadn't heard him approach. One moment the doorway was empty. The next he was filling it. That same gray suit, that same blank, pleasant face. Good evening, he said. I'm sorry to interrupt. Sarah turned to look at him, and I watched her expression change. Her smile faltered, her eyes widening slightly, and she went very still. The reaction lasted only a second before she recovered, her social training kicking in, but I'd seen it. That instinctive recoil, that animal recognition that something was wrong. This is Morrison, I said. He rents the spare room. Morrison, this is Sarah. He nodded to her. Pleased to meet you. I'll leave you to your dinner. And he was gone, moving silently back toward the stairs. Sarah waited until we heard his door close, before she leaned across the table, her voice low and urgent. What the hell was that? What do you mean? That person. There's something wrong with him. He's just quiet. No. She shook her head firmly. It's more than that. Didn't you feel it? It was like looking at a photograph of a person, not an actual person. Like he wasn't all the way there. Sarah, I'm serious. The way he moved, the way he looked, it was wrong. You need to get him out of here. But I couldn't explain to her that Morrison had never done anything wrong, that he was technically the perfect tenant, that my only complaints were based on absences and silences and a growing suspicion that he wasn't quite real. She'd think I was crazy. Maybe I was crazy. Sarah left early, claiming a headache, but I could tell she was unnerved. She hugged me tightly at the door and made me promise to call her tomorrow, to stay safe, to be careful. I assured her I would and watched her hurry to her car, glancing back at the house with undisguised concern. That night, I dreamed about Morrison. I dreamed that I opened his door and found the room empty, except for his gray suit hanging in the closet, moving as if someone invisible was wearing it. I dreamed that the suit turned to face me, and where the head should have been was just empty air, and a voice came from that emptiness. You need me. I'm filling the space. Without me, the silence would be unbearable. I woke with a gasp, my heart pounding. The house was silent around me. I checked my phone. 3:17 a.m. I got up and walked to Morrison's door. No light showed beneath it. I pressed my ear against the wood and listened. Nothing. I tried the handle. It turned easily unlocked, and the door swung open. The room was empty. Not just of Morrison, but of everything. The bed I'd provided was gone. The desk, the lamp, the curtains, all gone. Just bare walls, bare floor, bare window looking out onto the dark backyard. As if no one had ever lived there at all. But that was impossible. I'd just seen him hours ago, talking to Sarah. He'd walked up these stairs, gone into this room, closed this door. He had to be somewhere. I turned on every light in the house and searched it top to bottom. Morrison wasn't in the bathroom, wasn't in the kitchen, wasn't in any of the common areas. I even checked the basement and the attic, spaces I rarely entered. He was nowhere. At dawn, exhausted and frightened, I sat at the kitchen table with coffee I didn't drink and tried to make sense of what was happening. Maybe Morrison had left in the night, taking all his things. But there'd been no sound, no moving truck. No way to remove furniture without waking me. And his things had already been so minimal. Where had the bed gone? The desk. I pulled up my bank statements on my phone. The rent payments were all there, appearing like clockwork on the first of each month. I had proof he existed. I had proof he'd paid me. As the sun rose, I heard footsteps on the stairs. Slow, deliberate footsteps, coming down from the second floor. I froze, my coffee cup halfway to my lips, as Morrison walked into the kitchen. He looked exactly the same. Gray suit, pleasant expression, that strange quality of being not quite there. He nodded to me politely. "Good morning, Miss Chen. You're up early." I stared at him, unable to speak. He'd just walked out of a room I knew was empty. A room where nothing existed, where he couldn't possibly have spent the night. "Is something wrong?" he asked. tilting his head slightly. My voice came out as a whisper. "Who are you?" He smiled that small smile. "I'm your tenant, Ms. Chen. Just as we agreed. But you don't eat. You don't sleep. You don't exist. Not the way people exist." He was quiet for a long moment, and for the first time, his expression changed. Not to anger or fear or any strong emotion, but to something like sadness, a faint echo of regret. "Does it matter?" he asked softly. "I pay my rent. I cause no trouble. I fill the space you needed filled. Isn't that enough? I don't understand." "You were alone," he said. "The house was empty. The silence was eating at you. You needed someone here, something here, even if it was only the idea of someone. So I came." "What are you?" He shook his head. "The question isn't what I am. The question is, do you want me to leave?" I opened my mouth to say yes, to tell him to get out, to take whatever he was and go somewhere else to fill someone else's empty spaces. But the word wouldn't come. Because he was right. The house had felt less empty with him in it, even if he was barely there. The silence had felt less oppressive when I knew someone else was present, even if that someone never made a sound. "I don't know," I whispered. He nodded, as if he'd expected that answer. "I'll stay until you decide. That's all I can offer." He moved toward the front door, his steps making no sound on the hardwood floor. "I'll be back this evening," as always. And then he was gone, and I was alone again in my big empty house, wondering if he'd really been there at all, or if I'd been talking to nothing, filling my own silence with phantom conversations. The rent payment appeared in my account 3 days later, right on schedule, as if nothing had changed. Morrison still lives in my spare room, if lives is the right word. I still barely see him. Still never hear him eat or sleep or do any of the things that living people do. Sarah won't come over anymore. And the few other friends I've mentioned him to have reacted with similar unease, making excuses not to visit. But I haven't asked him to leave. Because here's the truth I can't quite admit to anyone. I need him. Not Morrison specifically, but what he represents. The illusion of not being alone. The presence that fills the silence without demanding anything from me. The perfect tenant who exists just enough to make the house feel less empty, but not so much that I have to actually engage with another person. Sometimes I wonder if he's even real, or if I've simply gone mad and created an elaborate delusion to cope with loneliness. Sometimes I wonder if the spare room is still empty and always has been, and Morrison is just a story I tell myself, a performance I stage for my own benefit. But the rent keeps coming. The door to his room opens and closes. Occasionally I catch glimpses of him, always in that gray suit, always with that pleasant blank expression. Always there, and never quite there. The perfect tenant. And I suppose that makes me the perfect landlord, willing to accept money from a ghost. A figment, a creature that might not exist at all, as long as it means. I don't have to face the emptiness of my house, the silence of my life, the unbearable truth that I am ultimately and completely alone. Tonight, I'll go to sleep knowing Morrison is in the next room. Or isn't. It doesn't matter anymore. The space is filled. That's all I ever really wanted. Story 8. The rain had stopped an hour ago, leaving the street slick and mirror, like under the dying afternoon light. I was walking home from work. The same route I'd taken for 3 years, past the same cracked sidewalks and tired storefronts. My shoes made soft splashing sounds through shallow puddles that dotted the pavement like wounds in the concrete. That's when I saw it. Just an ordinary puddle, really. No larger than a dinner plate. Nestled against the curb where the asphalt dipped slightly. The kind of puddle you'd step over without thinking, or splash through if you were a child. But I stopped. Something about it caught my eye in that indefinable way that makes you pause mid-stride. That animal instinct that whispers, "Look." The sky above me was the typical gray of early evening, heavy with clouds that promised more rain before nightfall. But the sky in the puddle, the reflection staring back up at me, was wrong. It was red. Not sunset red. Not the warm amber and orange of a beautiful evening. This was the red of fresh blood, deep and arterial, spreading across the reflected sky like a wound opening in heaven itself. I blinked, thinking it must be some trick of the light, perhaps a neon sign from one of the shops casting its glow. But when I looked around, all the storefronts were dark. The street was empty. I crouched down beside the puddle, my knees protesting slightly. The water was perfectly still, undisturbed by wind or movement. In it, I could see myself, my face pale and drawn, my work coat hanging loose on my shoulders. And behind me, that impossible crimson sky, roiling with clouds that seemed to move with purpose, swirling in patterns that hurt to follow with my eyes. I reached out slowly, my fingertips hovering just above the water's surface. The air felt colder here, right above the puddle, as if it were radiating a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn temperature. My breath came out in small white puffs, visible suddenly, though it hadn't been cold enough for that just moments before. The moment my finger touched the water, I felt it, a pool. Not physical exactly, but something deeper. Like the sensation of standing too close to the edge of a high place. That terrible magnetic urge to jump. The red sky in the reflection seemed to deepen, to become more vibrant, more real than the gray world around me. I could almost feel warmth emanating from it, even as my finger went numb in the cold water. I jerked my hand back and stood up quickly, my heart hammering against my ribs. When I looked down again, the puddle showed only gray sky. Normal, ordinary. I must have imagined it, I told myself. A trick of the light. Fatigue from a long day, stress playing games with my perception. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something looked back at me from that water. I hurried home, my pace just shy of running, glancing back over my shoulder twice. The puddle remained there on the curb, innocent and still, reflecting nothing but the ordinary world above it. That night, I dreamed of drowning in red sky, The next morning, I took a different route to work. I told myself it was to get more exercise, to see a different part of the neighborhood. The truth was simpler and more childish. I was afraid of that puddle. Afraid of what I might see if I looked into it again. For 3 days, I avoided that street entirely. On the 4th day, it rained again. Not a gentle rain, but a downpour that lasted from dawn until mid-morning, flooding gutters and overwhelming storm drains. I watched it from my office window, coffee growing cold in my hands, and thought about that puddle, about the red sky, about the pull I'd felt. By afternoon, the rain had stopped, and I found myself walking toward that street. I didn't decide to go there. My feet simply carried me in that direction, as if following a path worn into my subconscious. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that I was going to look at the puddle in daylight and see that it was nothing, just water and reflected sky, and then I could laugh at my own paranoia. The puddle was still there, larger now, swollen with rainwater, stretching almost 2 feet across. I stood at a safe distance and looked down into it. The red sky was back, but this time I could see more. The clouds in the reflection were moving faster, churning like a storm time lapse. And there were shapes in them. Dark silhouettes that could have been birds, or could have been something else entirely. Something larger. Something that moved with intention. I watched for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The shapes circled and dove through that blood, red sky, and I realized with a creeping sense of horror that they were getting closer. Not closer to the surface of the water, but closer to me, as if the puddle were a window and something on the other side was approaching it. A woman walked past me, her heels clicking on the wet pavement. She glanced at me oddly. A man standing frozen, staring at a puddle, but didn't stop. I wanted to grab her arm, to point at the water and ask, "Do you see it? Do you see what I see?" But the words stuck in my throat, and she was gone before I could force them out. When I looked back down, one of the shapes had grown large enough that I could make out details. It was vaguely humanoid, but wrong in proportions, with limbs that bent in too many places. It was descending through that red sky, growing larger with each passing second, and I realized with absolute certainty that it was coming here. I ran. I didn't look back. Didn't slow down until I was home with the door locked and every curtain drawn. My hands shook as I poured myself a drink I didn't want and couldn't make myself swallow. What was that thing? Where was that red sky? Why was it appearing in a puddle on a street corner? Sleep didn't come easily that night, and when it did, the dreams were worse. I was floating in that red sky, weightless and terrified, while shapes circled below me, or above me, or around me, because there was no up or down in that place. And somewhere in the distance, I could hear water dripping, each drop echoing like thunder. I called in sick the next day, and the day after. I couldn't make myself leave the apartment, couldn't risk walking past that street corner. But on the 3rd day, Curiosity overrode fear. I needed to know if it was real, if the puddle was still there, if the red sky would return. I went in the evening, when the light was failing and the street was mostly empty. The puddle was smaller now, reduced by days without rain to something no larger than a saucer. I approached it slowly, every nerve in my body screaming at me to turn around and leave. The red sky was there, but fainter now, as if seen through a veil. The shapes were gone, or at least I couldn't see them anymore. The reflection seemed to pulse gently, like a heartbeat, and as I watched, I realized I could hear it. A distant throbbing sound, rhythmic and organic, emanating from the water itself. I knelt beside the puddle, closer than I dared before. In the reflection, my face looked strange. Younger somehow, or older. I couldn't tell which. My eyes seemed darker, my expression more intense than I remembered ever seeing it. Behind me, that red sky stretched to infinity, and I felt again that terrible pull, stronger now. "What are you?" I whispered to the water. The reflection of my mouth moved, but the words that came out, soft and distant, as if traveling from very far away, were not mine. "Come and see." I fell backward, scrambling away from the puddle on my hands and knees, my heart threatening to tear itself free from my chest. The water remained still, reflecting only the normal gray evening sky. But I'd heard it. I'd heard something speak to me from inside the reflection, using my own voice, but not my words. I ran again, and this time I didn't stop until I was several blocks away, bent over and gasping for air, my lungs burning. A week passed. The weather turned dry, and I knew the puddle must have evaporated by now. I was safe. Whatever doorway or window I'd been looking through, it was closed now, dried up and gone. I could return to normal life, to my usual rotes and routines, and forget that any of it had happened. But I couldn't forget. Every puddle I saw made me pause. Every reflection in water or glass made my breath catch. I found myself looking for that red sky everywhere, wondering if it was limited to that one spot, or if it could appear anywhere, anytime, waiting for me to look down and see it staring back. Yesterday, it rained again. A brief shower in the late afternoon, just enough to dot the streets with fresh puddles. I avoided them all, walking carefully, keeping my eyes forward. But as I lay in bed last night, I couldn't help but wonder if the puddle had returned to that corner, if the red sky was back, if those shapes were waiting. This morning, I made myself walk past it. The puddle was there, reformed in the same depression in the asphalt, the same size and shape as before. I approached it with my heart in my throat, unable to stop myself, drawn by a need to know that overrode every instinct of self-preservation. The water was crystal clear, perfectly still. I could see every detail of the pavement beneath it, every small pebble and crack. And when I looked at the reflection of the sky, it was gray, normal. Ordinary autumn clouds drifting lazily overhead. Relief flooded through me so intensely that my knees nearly buckled. It was over. Whatever I'd seen, whatever window I'd been looking through, it was closed now. Perhaps it had never been real at all, just stress or fatigue or some strange hallucination brought on by... What? It didn't matter. It was over. I smiled at my own foolishness and turned to leave. That's when I noticed the sky above me. The real sky had turned red, not the gray I'd seen reflected in the puddle, not the normal overcast of an autumn day, but that same deep, arterial red I'd seen in the reflection, spreading from horizon to horizon like a wound opening in the fabric of reality itself. I looked around wildly. The street was still empty, the storefronts still dark. No one else was here to see it, to confirm that I wasn't losing my mind. And high above, in that impossible red sky, I could see shapes beginning to descend. I looked back down at the puddle. It reflected gray sky, normal sky, the sky that should have been there. And I understood, finally, what the puddle had been showing me all along. Not another world. Not a doorway or a window to somewhere else. It had been showing me the truth. The real sky. And the gray sky I'd been living under, the normal world I'd been walking through, was the reflection, the illusion, the lie. I am still standing here on this corner, looking up at the red sky while my reflection in the puddle looks up at gray. The shapes are getting closer now. I can see them more clearly. Those things that might be birds, or might be something else. Something that has no name in any language I know. And I wonder, have they always been there? Have we all been walking around beneath this red sky, this wounded heaven, while looking only at reflections, at shadows, at comfortable lies that show us what we expect to see? The first shape has almost reached the ground now. It's directly above me, descending slowly, and I can't make myself move or look away. In the puddle at my feet, my reflection shows a man standing on a normal street under a normal sky, unaware that anything is wrong. I don't know which of us is real anymore, but I think I'm about to find out. The sky grows redder still, and somewhere, distantly, I hear the sound of water dripping. Or is it the sound of something landing softly on wet pavement? I can't tell anymore. The boundary between the sound and the thing itself has become too thin, too permeable. I look down one last time at the puddle, at my reflection standing in that safe gray world. He looks so peaceful, so ignorant. I almost envy him, but I can't go back. Even if I wanted to, I don't think the way is open anymore. The red sky is all there is now, and it is beautiful in its way.